I was standing in the kitchen when I heard a heavy sound echoing from the lake behind the house. A dull, hollow thump, unlike anything familiar I had ever heard. When I stepped out onto the porch, my daughter-in-law's car was speeding away through a cloud of dust, the trunk still wide open. On the surface of the lake, something dark was tilting, rising and sinking very slowly, as if there were air trapped inside it. I didn't know what it was. I only knew it was too heavy to be thrown away casually, and too rushed to ignore without looking back. I stood frozen for a few seconds, then heard a very faint sound, not clearly water sloshing, not clearly anything else, just something being pressed from the inside. I ran down to the lake, not because I was certain, but because if I had turned my back at that moment, I probably would have never slept peacefully again for the rest of my life. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. My name is Ilara Whitcomb, 64 years old. I live alone in an old wooden house right beside a small crater lake on the southern edge of Oregon, where winters are long, summers are quiet, and people my age are often advised to slow down. Slow down. I had been slowing down for 7 months, ever since the day they called me at 3 a.m. and told me my son, Nathaniel, had died in a car accident on the highway. I don't remember how long I sat motionless in the kitchen that day. I only remember the steady ticking of the wall clock and how cold the coffee pot on the stove had become, so cold that when I touched it, I flinched from the chill. Nathaniel was my only child. I gave birth to him when I was 39, an age when doctors looked at me with concern back then. But Nathaniel came into my life like a late blessing, and I spent nearly the rest of my life revolving around him. He grew up by this lake. He fished with me from the old wooden dock. He sat on the porch reading books on summer afternoons. And then he grew up, moved away, studied mechanical engineering in Portland, and married Lysan, the woman who, from the first moment I met her, gave me a feeling I never quite knew how to name. Not dislike, not exactly suspicion, just cold. Lysan was always polite, too polite. Her smile was always measured, her voice always controlled, her eyes always seemed to be calculating something behind them. I never had proof that she was a bad person, but I also never once felt truly at ease around her. After Nathaniel's funeral, the relationship between Lysan and me nearly froze solid. She came to my house exactly twice to collect her husband's belongings. The first time, she was silent. The second time, irritated. Not a single question, not a single tear. Then she disappeared from my life, just as Nathaniel had disappeared from this world, until that afternoon. I stood on the porch, watching Lysan's car vanish down the winding dirt road. My heart was pounding so hard my ears rang. An open trunk is not a small thing. No one drives with their trunk open unless they are panicked, or in such a rush they don't bother checking behind them. I turned back toward the lake. The object had drifted a little farther out, but it hadn't fully sunk yet. It didn't float upright like a log, and it wasn't flat like an empty container. It tilted awkwardly, heavy as if struggling between staying afloat and being pulled under. A light breeze rippled the water, and then I heard that sound again. Not clearly, not loud enough to be called a cry, just something faint, like air being forced through a narrow gap. My heart clenched. Ilara, you're imagining things, I told myself. At my age, it's easy to let your mind run wild. I had lost my son. I lived alone. I heard a noise, saw a suitcase, and my brain immediately tried to connect everything into a horrifying story. But my hand stayed locked around the porch railing. I looked around. No one. No birds. No engine noise anymore. Just the lake and that dark object. I called out Lysan's name. Lysan. My voice sounded weak in the empty air. No answer. I called again, louder. Lysan. Still nothing. I stepped off the porch. The wet grass made my shoes slip slightly. My legs were shaking. I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from a fear that hadn't fully taken shape yet. When I reached the water's edge, I realized the object was no longer drifting. It was starting to sink, little by little, slowly but surely. Without thinking further, I hiked up my skirt and stepped into the lake. The water was brutally cold, soaking through my thin socks, biting into my skin like needles. I gasped, trying to keep my balance. The mud beneath the surface was soft and slick, making every step difficult. When my hand touched the object, I shuddered. Leather, not metal, not plastic. Leather, a suitcase. Dark leather, old, its surface wrinkled from the water. It was unbearably heavy. I had to use both hands, straining to pull it toward shore. My shoulders screamed with pain. My back felt like it might snap. "No, no, no," I muttered, not even sure what I was pleading for. Then I heard it, clearer than before. A very small sound, very weak, like someone inhaling, then not having the strength to exhale. I almost let go. My heart raced wildly. My throat burned dry. I dragged the suitcase onto the shore, letting it rest on the wet gravel. Water streamed out through the seams. I knelt in front of it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the zipper. "Elara, stay calm," I whispered to myself. "You don't know anything yet." But I did, not logically, instinctively. I pulled the zipper. It stuck. I yanked harder. It tore open with a harsh screech. The smell hit me first, dampness, lake water, and something else. Something I recognized from years ago when I was a young mother, the smell of milk. The suitcase opened. In that moment, my world stopped. Inside was a newborn baby, wrapped in a thin blanket soaked through. Its skin was pale. Its lips were blue. Its eyes were tightly shut. So small it felt like my heart was being crushed. I reached out and touched its chest. Cold. Far too cold. I pressed my ear down. At first, I heard nothing. 1 second, 2, then a faint breath. Almost non-existent. But there. "Oh my God," I gasped, tears spilling uncontrollably. "No, this can't be." I lifted the baby. It was so light it terrified me, like I was holding something that could disappear at any moment if I loosened my grip. I stood up, unsteady. My legs ached, but I felt none of it. I knew only one thing. This child was still alive. The baby was so light that I was afraid if I breathed too hard, it would dissolve in my arms. I stood frozen for a few seconds by the lake, my mind blank, but I didn't faint the way I always imagined someone would in a situation this horrifying. Maybe because the fear was too specific, too real for my body to allow collapse. I didn't have that right. Not now. I pulled the wet blanket tighter around the baby and pressed it against my chest. The small, freezing body against my clothes made me shiver, but it also snapped me back into reality. It was breathing, weakly, unevenly, but breathing. That alone was enough to make me start running. I don't remember exactly how I ran from the lake back to the house. I only remember gravel cutting into my feet, wet grass clinging to my skirt, and my heartbeat pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. I didn't dare look too closely at the baby's face. I was afraid if I did, I would see something that would steal my courage. So I focused on the path ahead, each step, each familiar stretch of ground leading back to the old wooden house. When I pushed open the kitchen door, the room felt terrifyingly quiet. The wall clock was still ticking steadily, as if the world had no idea a life was hanging by a thread. I set the baby down on the kitchen table and swept everything aside. Dishes, old newspapers, a dried flower vase, everything clattered to the floor. I didn't care. I just needed a flat surface. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to take several deep breaths before I could dial the phone. I called 911. Part of me was afraid I wouldn't be able to speak, that my voice would break into meaningless sounds. But when the calm voice of the dispatcher came on the line, something in me latched onto that steadiness like a lifeline. 911, what is your emergency? I found a baby, I said, my voice rough. A newborn. It was in the water. It's very cold. Where are you located? The voice asked, not raising her tone. I gave my address slowly, carefully, as if saying a single word wrong would cause everything to collapse. I heard typing on the other end. An ambulance is being dispatched, she said. Now I need you to follow my instructions, okay? I nodded instinctively, then realized she couldn't see me. Okay, I said. Please, hurry. Place the baby on a dry, flat surface, she instructed. If the clothes are wet, remove as much as possible and use dry towels to dry the baby. Do you have towels? I looked around as if my familiar kitchen had suddenly become foreign. Yes, I said, then ran to the bathroom, grabbing every clean towel I could find. I rushed back, knelt by the table, and began drying the baby with movements that were clumsy and desperate. Its skin was so cold I had to bite my lip to keep from sobbing. I wiped its chest, its tiny arms like fragile twigs, its little legs. I was afraid of hurting it, but even more afraid that if I was too gentle, I wouldn't warm it in time. Wrap the baby in dry towels, as many layers as possible, the dispatcher said. Keep the baby warm. Hold the baby against your body if you can. I did exactly that, pressing the baby to my chest, using what little warmth my aging body could offer. I bent my head down, pressed my cheek to its forehead, cold, but not as icy as at the lake. I listened for its breathing, counting each breath like counting the last seconds of time. It's breathing, I said, more to reassure myself than anyone else. Very weak. That's good, she replied. Keep doing what you're doing. The ambulance will arrive in a few minutes. A few minutes. Just a few minutes. But to me, they stretched into a lifetime. I sat on the kitchen floor, my back against the cabinets, the baby cradled in my arms. I began to rock gently, instinctively, a slow rhythm I didn't realize I still remembered. I whispered sounds that weren't really words, just soft murmurs, as if I were speaking directly to my own heart. Don't give up, I whispered, not sure who I was speaking to. Please, don't give up. The ambulance siren sounded in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder. When I heard it, a surge of strength rushed through me. I stood, unsteady, walked to the door, and flung it open as if they could see me from the road. Red and blue lights flickered against the old pine trees, reflecting off the lake behind the house. 2 paramedics rushed in, one middle-aged man with graying hair and a younger woman with her hair pulled back neatly. They looked at me, then at the baby in my arms, and their expressions changed instantly. Here, I said, my voice suddenly small. I found the baby in the lake. The woman gently took the baby from my arms. The way she held it made my chest ache and ease at the same time. Professional, firm, but never rough. The man opened his medical bag, pulling out equipment and a thermal blanket. Severe hypothermia, he said after a quick check. Signs of water aspiration. I stood there with empty arms, feeling as if the one thing keeping me upright had been taken away. I wanted to ask everything. Whether the baby would live, whether they could save it. But my throat locked tight, no words coming out. Would you like to come with us? The man asked, looking straight at me. I nodded immediately. Yes, I'm coming. They placed the baby on a small stretcher, wrapped it in a warming blanket, and fitted an oxygen mask. I followed them out, climbing into the ambulance with shaking legs. Inside, the lights were bright, the smell of antiseptic sharp. Machines hummed steadily, cold, clinical sounds, but strangely, they made me less afraid. Here, at least, there was order. There was process. There was hope. The ambulance started moving, the siren wailing through the early night. I sat on the side bench, my hands clasped tightly together, staring at the baby lying amid wires and machines. It looked smaller than ever, as if a strong gust of wind could carry it away. "What is your relation to the baby?" the woman asked, watching the monitor while adjusting the oxygen mask. I opened my mouth, then stopped. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know what I was to this child. I'm the one who found the baby," I said finally. She nodded and didn't ask anything else. The ambulance sped through familiar roads leading into town. I looked out the window at closed shops and houses sunk into darkness. Other people's lives were continuing as usual, while mine had just turned onto a path I had never prepared for. When the ambulance stopped in front of the hospital, everything moved very fast. The rear doors opened, cold air rushed in. The baby was wheeled out and I followed, almost running. The emergency department doors swung open, harsh white lights making me squint. "NICU," someone said. "Prepare the NICU." I was held back in the hallway as they pushed the stretcher through the automatic doors. I tried to keep looking, tried to memorize every detail. The blanket, the tiny mask, the little hand, as if turning away would make the baby disappear. The doors closed in front of me. I stood there alone in the long, cold hallway, and for the first time since I heard that dull splash by the lake, I allowed myself to shake with fear. The NICU doors shut, leaving a hollow ache in my chest. I stood there for a long time, until a nurse passing by gently touched my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I nodded out of habit, though I wasn't sure what okay even meant anymore. My hands were still shaking, not from the cold now, but from the feeling that I had been yanked out of a familiar reality and thrown into another world where I had no control over anything. I was led into a small waiting room next to the emergency department. Gray plastic chairs, white walls, the sharp smell of disinfectant seeping into every breath. I sat down, my hands clasped tightly together to keep them from trembling. In my mind, images of the baby kept appearing and fading, like a skipping film reel. Cold skin, weak breathing, the steady beeping of machines in the ambulance. I tried to cling to one concrete detail so I wouldn't drift into panic. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 people entered the room. One was a police officer in his 40s, his face serious but not cold. The other was a younger woman holding a thin folder. They introduced themselves and sat across from me. "Mrs. Whitcomb," the man said, his voice low and steady. "We need to take your statement about what happened tonight." I nodded. I had expected this. I knew the moment I called 911, my life would no longer be quiet. I just hadn't expected it to happen so fast while my hands were still shaking. I told them everything from the beginning. I didn't leave out a single detail I could remember. The sound from the lake, Lysan's car, the trunk wide open, the dark object on the water, the faint noise. I spoke slowly, carefully, as if talking too fast might make the story slip out of my grasp. "Are you certain it was Lysan's car?" the woman asked, her eyes never leaving her notebook. "Absolutely," I replied. "I've seen that car countless times. I couldn't mistake it." "Did you see the license plate clearly?" I shook my head. "No, the car was moving too fast, but I clearly saw the trunk was open." The man wrote something down, then looked up. "Did you see Lysan herself? Her face?" I hesitated for a second. "No, I only saw the car, but it was her car." The room fell silent for a few seconds. I felt a subtle shift in the air, not outright doubt, but a cautious step backward. The woman closed her notebook and studied me more closely. "Do you know where Lysan is right now?" "No," I said. I haven't spoken to her since my son's funeral." Hearing Nathaniel's name spoken aloud made my throat tighten. The man nodded, his expression softening slightly. "We understand this is a major shock," he said, "but we need to verify some details." He stood up and stepped out of the room. I didn't know where he went. I only knew that I suddenly felt abandoned on a chair that was too hard, in a room that was too bright. The woman stayed, watching me with an expression that wasn't unfriendly, but not fully trusting either. "Mrs. Whitcomb," she said more gently, Do you have any history of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, anything like that? The question stunned me. I knew they had to ask. I knew it was procedure. But hearing it still felt like someone touching a wound that hadn't healed yet. I lost my son 7 months ago, I said slowly. I was sad. I was in pain. But I'm not delusional. I don't imagine things that aren't real. She nodded and wrote something down. Are you currently taking any medication? I took a mild sedative for a few weeks after the funeral, I answered honestly, but I stopped a long time ago. She didn't say anything else, just nodded. But in her eyes, I saw something that weighed heavily on my heart. Hesitation. Not cruelty, but the kind of caution people reserve for those who have suffered a great loss, whose memories might be colored by grief. The man returned, holding a tablet. He set it on the table and turned the screen toward me. Mrs. Whitcomb, he said, we've done a quick check of traffic camera data near your area. My stomach tightened. Lysan's vehicle, he continued, was recorded at a gas station about 20 minutes from your house, around the same time you said you saw it leaving the lake. I stared at the screen. A blurry image appeared. A gray SUV, the same model as Lysan's, parked by a gas pump. A timestamp was clearly visible below it. That's impossible, I said, my voice higher than I wanted. I saw it, I'm sure. We're not saying you're lying, the man replied quickly. We're saying there's a discrepancy we need to understand. Maybe the camera is wrong, I said, even though I could hear how weak my own words sounded. Or it wasn't exactly the same time. The woman tilted her head slightly. Is it possible you're mistaken about the timing? That the incident happened earlier or later than you think? I opened my mouth, then closed it. I remembered the afternoon light, the angle of the sun on the lake, the ticking clock in my kitchen. But memory isn't something you can weigh against digital data. I knew that. Maybe, I said at last, but I'm not mistaken about the suitcase. Silence again. I saw them exchange a glance. Without a word, I understood what it meant. In their minds, my story was slipping from the realm of certainty into the realm of caution. The man let out a quiet breath. Mrs. Whitcomb, we need you to understand that we have to consider every possibility, especially in a serious situation like this. What about the baby? I asked, my voice trembling. If you don't believe me, what will happen to the baby? My question hung in the air. The woman looked at me, her expression softening slightly. The baby is being cared for, she said. Our top priority is the baby's safety. But if you think I'm mistaken, I pressed, unable to stop myself, if you think I imagine this, then Lysan won't be searched for, and if she really did this... I couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't dare. The man stood up, resting his hands on the table. We will continue investigating, he said, but you also need to rest. You've been through a very difficult night. Rest. The word felt absurd. When they left, I remained alone in the brightly lit room, feeling as though I had been removed from the center of my own story. I was no longer the woman who saved a baby. I was a witness, and worse, a witness they didn't fully trust. For the first time that night, I wondered if I truly could have been mistaken, if the light, the grief, the loss had played tricks on my memory. The thought sent a chill through me. If I was wrong, then who was I in this story? But then the image of the suitcase came back with brutal clarity, the weight pulling at my arms, the soaked leather, the faint sound from inside, the icy cold when I touched the baby. Those weren't dreams. They weren't distorted memories. I might be mistaken about many things, but not about the suitcase. I sat alone in the waiting room for nearly an hour after the police left. No one told me where to go or what to do next. I didn't ask. I just sat there, my back against the cold wall, my eyes fixed on the NICU doors, as if staring long enough might let me see through them and know how the baby was doing. An older nurse brought me a cup of water and set it on the small table beside me, gently telling me I should drink something. I thanked her, but I only held the cup without drinking. The water trembled with the uncontrollable shaking in my hands. Time moved painfully slowly, each minute stretching out. I heard medical shoes echoing in the hallway, automatic doors opening and closing, announcements calling patient names somewhere farther away. Everything continued as normal while inside me there was only a heavy emptiness. Finally, a doctor stepped out from the NICU area. He looked to be in his 50s, with graying hair and a calm, measured voice. He studied me for a moment before speaking, as if weighing each word. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, "the baby is a bit more stable now. We're keeping the baby warm and supporting breathing. The condition is still serious, but the baby is fighting." I nodded, unsure I could still speak. My throat was dry, but my heart beat faster with a fragile spark of hope. "We need to run some tests," he continued, "including a DNA test." I looked at him, not immediately understanding. "To do what?" "To identify relatives," he said. "In cases like this, we need to know who the baby belongs to, whether there are any biological family members. That's very important for care and future decisions." I fell silent. Part of me had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like something quietly breaking inside me. I didn't know who this baby was. I didn't know where it came from. I only knew I had found it in a suitcase. "Are you willing to provide a sample?" the doctor asked calmly. I nodded. "Yes, if needed." A nurse led me into a small room to take a cheek swab. The process was quick, almost mechanical. I sat there, watching the swab touch the inside of my mouth, wondering what I was stepping into. I didn't allow myself to think too far ahead. I just followed instructions, one step at a time, as if not thinking would make it easier. Then came more waiting. I left the hospital after it was fully dark, but I didn't go home. I couldn't. I returned to the waiting room and sat there for several more hours, until another nurse gently told me I should go rest. They would call if anything changed. I stood up, my legs heavy as lead, and left the hospital feeling as if I were abandoning a piece of myself behind those doors. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with the lights on, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. Images of Nathaniel filled my mind, his smile as a child, the way he called me Mom in his warm, steady voice as an adult. I searched the final months before his death for any sign I might have missed. Had he ever said anything about becoming a father? Had I ever noticed anything unusual about Lysanne? I couldn't remember, or maybe I hadn't wanted to remember. The next morning, the phone rang before it was fully light outside. I sat up instantly, my heart pounding. "Mrs. Whitcomb," the doctor's voice from the day before said, "Could you come to the hospital? We have the results." I didn't ask what the results were. I just said I would be there right away. I drove in a half-awake haze, the familiar road suddenly feeling strange. When I arrived, they led me into a small consultation room. The doctor was there, along with a woman I recognized as a hospital social worker, and a man in plain clothes I assumed was a police officer. The air in the room felt heavy. "Mrs. Whitcomb," the doctor said slowly, "the DNA results confirm that you have a direct biological relationship with the baby." I held my breath. "Specifically," he continued, "you are the baby's biological grandmother." I heard the words, but my mind couldn't process them right away. Biological grandmother. The two words hovered in the air, refusing to connect. I looked from one person to another, waiting for someone to say there had been a mistake. "That can't be," I whispered. "My son, Nathaniel, he's dead. He didn't have a child." The police officer lowered his head slightly, his voice turning more serious. "According to the results, the baby is Nathaniel's child." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I gripped the edge of the chair to keep from falling. Images of the suitcase, the lake, the baby's bluish face overlapped with Nathaniel's face in my mind, forming a chaotic blur that made it hard to breathe. "I didn't know," I said, my voice trembling. "I never knew Lysanne was pregnant." The social worker nodded. We only just learned that as well. Based on medical estimates, Lisanne was already pregnant before Nathaniel passed away. Before he died. The phrase pierced me like a blade. I tried to remember the few times I had seen Lisanne during that period. She always wore loose coats, her frame naturally slender. I had assumed it was simply her style. I hadn't asked. I hadn't looked closely. She concealed the pregnancy, the police officer added. So far, we haven't found any official prenatal care records. I shook my head, as if the motion could drive away the reality that had just been placed on my shoulders. Why? I asked, almost pleading. Why didn't she tell anyone? No one answered right away. The doctor cleared his throat and shifted to another topic, though his voice remained heavy. There's one more thing, he said. Based on the DNA results and the circumstances, we've shared the information with the police. They've decided to reopen the case regarding your son's death. I turned to the police officer. He nodded in confirmation. Nathaniel's accident, he said, was initially ruled as a loss of control on a wet road, but with the new information, we need to re-examine it. Re-examine it how? I asked, even as a nameless fear began taking shape inside me. We've requested a new inspection of the vehicle, he said, and there are indications that the braking system may have been tampered with. I heard myself inhale deeply, then realized I couldn't breathe out right away. The brakes, tampered with. The words drilled into my head, warping every memory of the night Nathaniel died. You mean... I couldn't finish the sentence. We can't draw conclusions yet, the officer said carefully, but there is a possibility that it wasn't a simple accident. I closed my eyes. I saw Nathaniel driving in the rain as clearly as if it were happening again. He had called me a few hours before the crash just to ask if I was doing okay. I had told him I was fine. I hadn't known that would be the last time I ever heard his voice. And Lisanne? I asked, opening my eyes. Where is she? The officer shook his head. We haven't been able to determine her current location. The room fell silent again. It felt as if the world had collapsed, revealing a deeper, darker layer beneath it, one I had never imagined. My son was dead. I had buried him. I had learned how to live with that pain. And now they were telling me he had a child, that his death might not have been an accident, that the woman I once called my daughter-in-law had hidden everything. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but beneath the fear I sensed something else forming, a hard, cold resolve. The baby, I said slowly. My grandchild is still alive, right? The doctor nodded. Yes, and we're doing everything we can. I nodded too. In my mind, a truth no one wanted to face was coming into focus. That baby was not an accident. It was the final link in a chain of events I was only just beginning to see. And if my son truly died because someone wanted him dead, then that baby had never been safe from the very beginning. I left the hospital in the late afternoon, my head heavy as if stuffed with stones. What I had just learned didn't allow me to collapse, but it didn't allow me to stand still either. Something had been hidden for far too long, and now it was beginning to surface, piece by piece, cold and sharp. 2 days later, I received a call from the county sheriff. He said they needed to meet with me to discuss some new findings related to Nathaniel. His tone wasn't urgent, but it was heavy enough to tell me this was no small matter. I drove to the police station on a gray morning, the Oregon sky low and pressing down, as if it were bearing weight on my shoulders as well. They led me into a small conference room. A thick folder was already sitting on the table. I recognized my son's name printed on the cover immediately. Seeing that name in bold letters on paper, not on a gravestone or a death certificate, tightened my chest in a different way. A young investigator spoke first. He said they had begun reviewing Nathaniel's financial records from the 6 months before his death. At first, it was standard procedure, but the numbers didn't sit as quietly as they had expected. Your son had a fairly large life insurance policy, he said, sliding a copy toward me. I looked down. The figure stood out clearly, cold and impersonal, much larger than anything I had ever thought Nathaniel needed. I remembered casually asking him about insurance once over dinner. He had said it was just in case. I hadn't asked more. The original beneficiary, the investigator continued, was his wife. I swallowed, Lysan. But, he paused, flipping to another page. There was a change. I looked up at him, then at the older investigator sitting across from me. The older man nodded. About 3 weeks before his death, he said, Nathaniel updated the policy. I bent back down to read. The legal language blurred before my eyes, but one line stood out clearly. The beneficiary was changed to the insured's biological child, or any child born in the future. It felt as if an invisible hand tightened around my chest. Biological child. Future child. He knew. Nathaniel had known. His will was also amended, the younger investigator said, his voice slower now as if trying not to break me. All assets, the house, savings, investment funds, were placed into a trust for the child if the child were born. I placed my hand on the table to steady myself. In my mind, Nathaniel no longer appeared as the son who always smiled when he came home to visit, but as a man who saw danger approaching and chose to stand in front of it. That means, I said quietly, almost to myself, it means, the older investigator finished, that if the baby lives, Lysan receives nothing from the will or the insurance, not a single dollar. The room went silent. No one needed to say anything else. Every piece fell into place without force. Nathaniel dies, Lysan collects the insurance money. The baby dies, the trust becomes meaningless. 2 deaths, 1 stream of money. I closed my eyes. A wave of nausea rose, not from the grief of losing my son, a grief I had carried for 7 months, but from the cold clarity of the motive now exposed. I had believed my family's tragedy was fate, a slick curve on a rainy night. Now it had the shape of numbers and signatures. We believe the motive is fairly clear, the investigator said, at least financially. I opened my eyes. And the baby? I asked. What about the baby? He met my gaze without looking away. If the baby doesn't survive, Lysan could attempt to challenge the will. There are multiple legal scenarios. I let out a hollow laugh, the sound unfamiliar even to me. So, the baby was the final obstacle. No one contradicted me. I left the police station feeling as though I had walked through a storm without warning. Everything I thought I knew about Nathaniel's marriage, about Lysan, about the final months of my son's life, everything had been turned upside down. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, yellow lamplight falling over the family photos on the wall. There was one picture of Nathaniel and Lysan on their wedding day. They stood side by side, smiling brightly. I used to look at that photo and think my son had finally found a partner. Now I looked at it as silent evidence of my own innocence. I remembered my last conversations with Nathaniel. He had seemed more tired, smiled less. Once, when I asked if he was okay, he had simply said, "I'm worried about the future." I had assumed it was work stress, family responsibility. I hadn't understood that he was talking about a life not yet born. I stood and walked into Nathaniel's old bedroom, the room I had kept exactly as it was from the day he left home. I opened his desk drawer. Inside were old papers, notebooks, a few bills. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I needed to touch the things he had touched, as if doing so might bring me closer to him. In an old envelope, I found a copy of the will. I had seen it at the police station, but holding it now felt different. On the final page, next to Nathaniel's signature, there was a small handwritten line, "For my child. So my child will be safe." My tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink. I slid down to the floor, my back against the bed, and for the first time in days I allowed myself to cry out loud, not just because Nathaniel was dead, but because he had died while trying to protect his child. The thought was both devastating and suffocating, but it also lit a fire inside me I hadn't known was still there. My son had chosen that path. He had placed his child above his own life and safety, and now that child was still alive, fragile, but alive. I wiped my tears and stood up. I looked around the room at Nathaniel's belongings, and in that moment something became clearer than ever. If Lisanne had been willing to kill her husband for money and willing to throw her own child into a lake to remove the final obstacle, then I couldn't pretend things would simply resolve on their own. No miracle appears unless someone steps forward to protect what matters. My son had done his part. Now it was my turn. I wasn't an investigator. I wasn't a lawyer. I was just a mother, and now a grandmother. But I knew one thing for certain. That baby existed because Nathaniel paid for it with his life, and I would not allow that death to be meaningless. That night, I returned to the hospital. I stood behind the NICU glass, looking at the baby lying there, tiny among tubes and machines. Its chest rose and fell weakly but steadily. I placed my hand against the glass and whispered, even though I knew the baby couldn't hear me. "Your father did everything for you," I said, "and your grandmother will too." Under the cold white lights of the intensive care unit, I understood that the truth had surfaced not to punish me, but to prepare me for what lay ahead. Because if the motive was this clear, then the real battle was only just beginning. They didn't say it outright. No one walked into the room and bluntly declared that Evan, the baby I had just learned was my grandson, didn't belong to me. That truth came slowly, layer by layer, through carefully chosen words, evasive nods, and forms placed on the table in voices so polite they felt cold. 3 days after the DNA results were confirmed, a representative from the Oregon Department of Child and Family Services came to the hospital to meet me. She was young, neatly dressed, her voice soft. She spoke at length about procedure, about the child's best interests, about evaluations for the future. I listened and nodded, but in my mind one question repeated over and over: where will Evan be? "For now," she said, placing her hand on the folder, "the baby is under temporary state custody." The words were light, almost gentle, but they slammed into my chest like a door being shut. Under state custody. Not mine, not family, a system. "I'm his grandmother," I said, my voice low but firm. "You know that?" "Yes," she replied. "We've documented that, but it doesn't automatically grant guardianship." I wanted to ask why, but I had lived long enough to know the answer wouldn't fit into a single word. It lived in decades of policy, in checklists written by people who had never stood in front of NICU glass, watching a tiny life struggle to breathe. They handed me a list of requirements if I wanted to be considered for temporary guardianship. It was longer than I expected. A full medical evaluation, a criminal background check, a psychological assessment, a home study, in-depth interviews, and finally, a review meeting where I would have no authority, only the right to wait. "Can I see Evan?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. The young woman hesitated. "At this time, visits must be approved individually. The baby is still in a sensitive recovery phase." I understood what that meant. Not yet, or maybe not at all, or whenever it was convenient. That day, I left the hospital without seeing Evan. For the first time since pulling the suitcase from the lake, I truly felt powerless. Not because I was weak, but because suddenly nothing depended on my will anymore. The weeks that followed blurred into a long stretch of paperwork and waiting rooms. I went from the hospital to government offices, from clinics to evaluation centers. I answered questions I never imagined being asked at this stage of my life. "Do you have a history of depression?" "I lost my son," I answered. Who wouldn't grieve in that situation? They wrote it down, nodded, checked a box. Do you have long-term support? I have friends, I have neighbors. They pressed further. Who? Where? Could they commit? During the psychological evaluation, the woman sitting across from me was younger than Nathaniel had been on the day he graduated. She asked how I felt when I saw Evan. I told the truth, that I felt afraid and grateful at the same time, hurt and purposeful at once. She asked whether I thought I was trying to compensate for the loss of my son by holding on to the baby. I stayed silent for a long time before answering. I'm not compensating, I said. I'm continuing. She wrote it down. No reaction. The preliminary results came faster than I expected and colder than I had hoped. I was assessed as not ideal for long-term caregiving. Age. Potential decline in health in the future. Psychological records noting a period of profound grief after my son's death. No younger co-guardian within the immediate family. Not ideal. The phrase clung to me like a label I couldn't peel off. I had raised a child to adulthood. I had worked my entire life. I had survived difficult years without anyone holding my hand. But in front of a checklist, I became a risk. They said Evan would be placed with a temporary foster family once he was stable enough to leave the NICU, a family that was certified, experienced, more suitable in the long term. And what about me? I asked. What am I in all of this? The answer came after an uncomfortable pause. You are a biological relative, they said, and you may apply for supervised visitation. Visitation. Supervised. As if I were a potential threat. I didn't cry in front of them. I saved my tears for the long nights at home when the kitchen was silent and the chair Nathaniel used to sit in was still empty. I sat there thinking about Evan, about the weak rise and fall of his chest, about the tiny hand that had once curled around my finger through a sterile glove. I wondered whether a system could understand that feeling, whether there was a box on any form where love could be recorded. I fought, not by shouting or pounding the table. I fought with the persistence only people who have lived long enough possess. I made phone calls. I wrote letters. I showed up on time for every appointment. I carried every document they requested, neatly organized in an old briefcase. Eventually, they allowed me to see Evan twice a week, 30 minutes each. Time. Under the supervision of a social worker. I received the notice in a short, emotionless email. When I finished reading it, I had to sit down because my legs suddenly felt weak. The first visit took place in a small room near the NICU. Evan had been moved to a portable incubator, fewer wires attached, his skin more pink. When they placed him in my arms, carefully guiding every movement, I felt something inside me click into place. He was so light that I was afraid even breathing too hard would make him tremble. I looked at that tiny face, trying to memorize every feature. Evan didn't know who I was. He didn't know about Nathaniel. He didn't know about the lake, the suitcase, or the numbers written into a will. But he knew warmth. He knew a heartbeat. When I rocked him gently, he grew quieter, as if that small body recognized something familiar that his mind couldn't yet name. 30 minutes passed with brutal speed. When the social worker told me my time was up, I didn't argue. I only leaned down and whispered a sentence meant for my ears alone. I'm here, I said. I'm not going anywhere. The visits became the only axis my life revolved around. I measured time by the distance between moments when I was allowed to see Evan. Everything else, paperwork, evaluations, meetings, was just noise. Evan was the only reason I stayed upright, the reason I got out of bed every morning, the reason I didn't let myself slide into darkness. There were days I went home and wondered whether I was fighting the inevitable. Whether the system would crush me without mercy, whether one day they would say it was enough and Evan would disappear from my reach forever. But every time that thought surfaced, I remembered Nathaniel, the handwritten line in the will, the truth that my son had not stepped back when he knew he could lose everything. If he hadn't given up, neither would I. I didn't know whether I would win or lose. I only knew that giving up wasn't an option. Not while Evan was still there, still breathing, still gripping my finger with a weak but determined strength. Not when I was the only person in the world who could see the entire story, from the quiet lake to the lifeless conference rooms. On paper, that child might belong to no one. But in my heart, Evan already had a place no official stamp could erase. I was washing my only coffee mug in the sink when my phone vibrated on the kitchen table. The sound was too loud in the quiet house, making me flinch. I wiped my hands on a towel, glanced at the screen once, then turned away. An unknown number. I had learned not to answer calls like that since the day Nathaniel died. Wrong numbers, sales voices, strangers who didn't know how small my world had become. I let the phone vibrate 2 more times, then silenced it. But just as I turned my back, a chill ran straight down my spine. Not a vague intuition, something specific, familiar, as if someone had just touched the house from the outside. I turned back and picked up the phone. The screen lit up again, same number. I answered before I could think any further. "Mrs. Alara," the voice said slowly, low and calm in a way that made my skin crawl. "You finally answered." I didn't need to ask who it was. That voice, even after 7 months, carried the same artificial rhythm I had recognized the very first time we met. "Lysan," I said. Not loud, not shaking. I surprised myself. There was a soft exhale on the other end, like a soundless smile. "I knew you'd recognize me." My heart pounded, but my mind felt strangely cold. I leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Why are you calling?" I asked. "To talk," she replied. "About Evan." The name made my stomach tighten. Evan. She said it as if she had the right. "You have nothing to say to me," I said, "and nothing to do with him." A quiet laugh followed. "Don't pretend to be righteous with me, Alara. I know Evan is alive." The sentence dropped like a stone. Even though I had prepared myself for this possibility, hearing it spoken still knocked my breath off rhythm. "You don't know anything," I said, even knowing how weak it sounded. "I know enough," Lysan said. "I know you pulled him out of the lake. I know the hospital ran tests. I know you're his grandmother. Did you really think that could stay hidden forever?" I closed my eyes briefly. That meant she had been watching, or someone had told her, or worse, she had never gone as far away as I thought. "What do you want?" I asked bluntly. Her voice lowered, slower now, as if she were explaining something perfectly reasonable. "I want what belongs to me." "Evan doesn't belong to you," I said, and this time my voice didn't stay calm. "You threw him into the lake." "That was an accident," Lysan said immediately, without hesitation. "I panicked. I had just given birth. I wasn't in control." I let out a dry laugh. "You think I believe that?" "You don't have to believe it," she replied. "You just have to understand that I'm his mother. The law is more on my side than you think." I didn't answer. I walked slowly toward the small desk in the living room where I kept Nathaniel's old voice recorder. A strange habit, holding on to my son's things as if he were still somewhere in the house. I pressed record and set the phone on speaker. "Go on," I said. "What do you want?" "Money," Lysan said without circling it, "and Evan." The bluntness almost made me feel relieved. No pretending, no hiding. "How much?" I asked. "Not how much," she corrected. "Everything, the insurance, the trust, what Nathaniel left for the baby." I swallowed hard. "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll show up," Lysan said calmly, like she was talking about the weather. "I'll see a lawyer. I'll tell a different story. That you panicked, that you made things up, that you stole my child." "Who do you think will believe you?" I asked. "People tend to believe the younger one," she replied. "More stable, less loss." A cold anger rose inside me. Not explosive, but the kind that comes from living long enough to understand the cruelty behind words like that. "You will never touch Evan again," I said slowly. "I swear it." Lysanne laughed. "Don't make promises you don't have the power to keep. I'm giving you two options. Either you hand Evan over to me along with access to the assets, or I make this very ugly." "I'm recording this call," I said, not sure why I said it out loud. There was a pause of a few seconds. I could hear her breathing through the speaker. "You think that scares me?" Lysanne said. "I've survived worse." The call ended abruptly. No goodbye, no further threat, just an empty silence, as if someone had cut a wire. I stood there for a long time after the screen went dark. My hands were shaking, but I didn't sit down. I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to stand up again right away. I called the county sheriff before I could second-guess myself. When I finished telling him everything, there was a long silence on the other end. "You did the right thing by recording it," he said. "This is very important." They came to my house within 40 minutes, 2 men and a woman, all in plain clothes. They listened to the recording twice. No one spoke while it played. "She made a mistake," the female officer said finally. "She contacted you directly." "What do you want me to do?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. The sheriff looked at me, his expression heavy. "We want you to cooperate." "How?" "By continuing to talk to her," he said. "Let her believe you're considering it." I looked at him without blinking. "You want me to be bait?" He didn't deny it. "We'll be close. We'll protect you." I thought about Evan, about the small room where I was allowed to hold him twice a week, about the possibility that one wrong step could cost me him forever. "She's dangerous," I said. "You know that." "We do," he replied, "but this may be our best chance to catch her." I stayed silent for a long time. In my mind, I saw Nathaniel's face, not at the end, but when he was alive, the rare, serious look he had when he had made up his mind. "If I refuse," I asked, "then what?" "We continue investigating," he said, "but she may disappear." I closed my eyes. When I opened them, I had my answer. "I'll do it," I said. The female officer started to object, but the sheriff raised his hand to stop her. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has chosen the harder path. "You understand the danger?" he asked. "I do," I said. "But I also understand that if I don't step forward, Evan will never be safe." They left after dark. The house returned to its familiar silence, but this time it carried a different weight. I sat down in the chair and stared into the empty space in front of me. There are calls you shouldn't answer, and there are calls that, once answered, will never let you return to your old life. From that moment on, I knew I had stepped into a game whose rules I didn't get to set. But if being bait was the only way to end this, for Evan, then I was willing. The meeting was set for a moonless night. The police said it wasn't random. People like Lysanne preferred darkness, the sense of control that comes when others can't see clearly. I nodded and didn't ask more. I had agreed to step into this. There was no room for half measures. She chose an abandoned warehouse by the old lake, less than a 10-minute drive from my house. I knew the place. When Nathaniel was little, he used to take me there, proudly calling it his secret fortress. Later, the building was abandoned. Broken windows, rusted metal roof. No one ever went there anymore. I never imagined I'd return under circumstances like this. The police prepared everything carefully. They checked my car, clipped a small recording device beneath my collar, went over every detail with me. Move slowly, speak little, let Lysanne talk. I listened and memorized it all, but strategy wasn't what filled my mind. All I could see was Evan lying in the incubator, his tiny hand curling each time cold air touched it. I told myself I couldn't afford to make a single mistake. I arrived 10 minutes early. The warehouse loomed beside the lake, dark and silent like a solid block of shadow. A light wind rippled the surface of the water. I parked the car and sat still for a few seconds to breathe. My hands rested on the steering wheel, feeling my heartbeat steady and even. I didn't want Lysanne to see that I was afraid. Another set of headlights appeared at the bend in the road. The car stopped a few yards from mine. The door opened, and Lysanne stepped out. For a split second, I almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was shorter, dyed dark, her face thinner, sharper. She wore an oversized jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, but her walk hadn't changed. Still that slightly overconfident stride, as if the world owed her something. "You're early," Lysanne said calmly. "I don't like waiting," I replied. She gave a faint smile, her eyes flicking quickly around the lakeshore. "You've always been straightforward. Nathaniel was too. That was both of your weakness." I clenched my jaw and said nothing. I stepped out of the car and faced her, keeping the distance the police had instructed. The warehouse behind Lysanne was pitch black, its door slightly ajar. "Where's the money?" she asked bluntly. "I want to hear you say it all," I replied. "Everything." She raised an eyebrow. "You still think you get to set conditions?" "I do," I said. "Because if I didn't, you wouldn't have called me." A brief silence followed. Then she laughed. "Fine. I suppose you deserve to know." She leaned back against the metal door of the warehouse, arms crossed, her voice slow and measured, like she was reciting a story she had rehearsed many times. "Nathaniel didn't understand," she began. "He always thought everything could be solved by talking. Family, responsibility, children." She curled her lip. "I never wanted that life." "Then why marry him?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Because he was stable," Lysanne replied without hesitation. "Because of the money. Because it meant an easy life. I thought I could tolerate it for a few years, and then everything would be fine." "Until you got pregnant." Her eyes darkened for a moment. "Yes, until I got pregnant. I never planned that." "But Nathaniel did," I said. "He changed his will." Lysanne laughed again, this time unable to hide the bitterness. "Exactly. And that's when I realized I was about to lose everything." She continued, each word clear and unbroken. "Nathaniel discovered the pregnancy, wanted to keep the baby, wanted to be a father, wanted to do the right thing. He talked about the future, about responsibility, about making sure the money stayed with the child. With every sentence, Lysanne felt another door closing in front of her. "I couldn't let that happen," she said coldly. "I couldn't let a child trap my life." "I couldn't let you kill my son," I said, my voice shaking. Lysanne looked straight at me. "I didn't kill him in a moment of anger. I didn't lose control. I planned it." I heard my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "The brakes," she went on, "a small adjustment, a believable accident. Everything would end cleanly." "And Evan?" I asked, my throat burning. She exhaled as if speaking about an inconvenience. "That was the final step. Without it, things would get complicated. I thought, if he didn't exist, everything would go back to the way it was supposed to be." "You call that a solution?" I asked, unable to hold back any longer. "Yes," Lysanne replied without hesitation. "A solution." My entire body went cold, but my hand stayed tight around the small panic button hidden in my palm. I remembered the police's words. "Wait a little longer." "And now?" I asked. "What do you plan to do now?" "Now I want to finish this," Lysanne said. "You hand Evan over to me. You hand over the money. I disappear. You get to live out the rest of your grief-stricken but peaceful life." "I won't do that," I said. Her eyes darkened. "I gave you a chance." In a movement so fast I barely registered it, Lysanne pulled a gun from inside her jacket. The metal flashed under the car lights, cold and terrifyingly real. "I didn't want to do this," she said, her voice perfectly steady. "But I don't have a choice anymore." I didn't step back. I looked straight at her, and in that moment I no longer saw my former daughter-in-law. I saw a stranger who had chosen this path a long time ago. "Evan will never belong to you," I said. My finger pressed hard on the panic button, 3 times, just like they had told me. The sound that filled my ears wasn't a siren, but a sharp explosion that tore through the air. The gunshot echoed off the warehouse walls and dissolved into the surface of the lake, leaving a suffocating silence behind it. I felt a powerful force shove me backward. Everything slowed down for a brief heartbeat. I didn't know where the bullet went. I only knew that in that moment, the line between life and death was so thin I could feel it against my skin. Then from the darkness around the warehouse, red and blue lights erupted and shouted commands shattered the night. I didn't fall right away. I remember that instant clearly, like a photograph frozen inside my chaotic mind. The shot had just gone off. My ears were ringing. The air felt torn apart. I staggered one step, my back hitting the car door, and only then did the pain crash over me, hot, deep, and unmistakably real, spreading from my left shoulder down my arm. I lifted my hand on instinct. Blood. Dark red. Not as much as I had expected, but enough to make my head spin. Then the red and blue lights flared again, ripping through the darkness. Shouting, running footsteps, the clatter of metal. I heard someone yell, "Police, drop the weapon now!" Lysanne turned around. In that brief moment, I saw her face clearly under the lights. No calm left, no confidence. Only fury mixed with panic. Her hand still held the gun, but it hesitated. "Drop it!" another voice shouted, sharper, more final. Lysanne looked around like a trapped animal. Then very slowly she let go. The gun hit the concrete with a dry clatter. Immediately, 2 officers rushed forward, slamming her to the ground and cuffing her hands behind her back. She started screaming, not in desperation, but in curses and threats, as if she still believed she could control the situation. No one responded. I slid down to the ground. My head was spinning, but I stayed conscious. A female officer knelt in front of me, placing a hand on my shoulder, carefully, avoiding the wound. "You've been shot," she said, "but you're okay. The bullet grazed soft tissue. It didn't hit bone." I nodded, not sure I fully understood. My eyes stayed fixed on Lysanne as she was dragged away. She twisted her head back to look at me, her gaze raw with hatred, completely unmasked. "I'll come back," she screamed. "You can't keep him forever." The police car door slammed shut. The sound was final, like a period at the end of a long, dark chapter. I was taken into an ambulance. The light inside was cold and white, the machines humming steadily. The paramedic kept talking to me, asking my name, the date, whether I felt dizzy. I answered slowly but clearly. There was only one thought in my mind. Where is Evan? "When can I see my grandson?" I asked. "You need stitches first," he replied, "but the baby is safe. We've confirmed it." I closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, my chest loosened just a little. My injury wasn't serious. The bullet had gone off course, leaving a long but shallow tear. The doctor said I was lucky. I didn't feel lucky the way they meant it. I just felt alive. The days that followed moved faster than I expected. There was too much to do, too many people to talk to. I met with investigators, prosecutors, lawyers. I listened to the recording again, watched the footage from the officers' body cameras. I signed endless statements. The evidence was too clear to deny. The confession at the warehouse, the recorded phone call, proof of brake tampering, the insurance money trail, the hidden pregnancy. All of it lined up into a cold, logical chain, leaving no room for doubt. The trial came sooner than I ever imagined. There was no television-style drama, no long theatrical arguments. Everything moved like a well-oiled machine, just waiting for someone to press the button. I sat in the back row, my shoulders still wrapped in white bandages. Lysanne sat at the front, dressed in a gray inmate uniform. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. Her face was empty, as if every emotion had long since been burned away. When the prosecutor read the charges, first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted infanticide, I felt each word land heavily in the room. Not because I was shocked, but because what I had known in my bones was finally being spoken out loud, publicly, beyond denial. The sentence was handed down on a rainy afternoon. Life imprisonment, no parole, no possibility of reduction. Lysanne didn't cry. She didn't scream. She only gripped the edge of the bench as if trying to hold on to something already lost forever. I left the courthouse in silence. There was no sense of victory, only a quiet emptiness, like when the storm finally passes, leaving the ground soaked and the sky pale gray. Justice had arrived, but it didn't bring the relief people always promise. Evan was moved to a secure care unit shortly after the arrest. When I visited, he was stronger. His skin was pink, his cry powerful. When the nurse placed him in my arms, I felt the true weight of a life growing, no longer as fragile as the day I pulled the suitcase from the lake. "You're safe now," I whispered, pressing my forehead to his. "No one will hurt you anymore." A few weeks later, I received the temporary ruling from family court. I was recognized as Evan's legal guardian while long-term arrangements were reviewed. The document wasn't long, the language dry, but when I held it in my hands, I had to sit down. I thought of all the times they had said I wasn't ideal, all the forms, all the judging looks. And in the end, it was the truth, harsh and painful, that had opened this path. Evan slept in the crib beside me as I read the ruling for the third time. His breathing was deep and steady. I looked at him, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that the future wasn't completely dark. Justice came late. It didn't save Nathaniel, it didn't erase the months of fear, but it came soon enough to keep Evan in this world. And for me, that was everything I could have ever asked for. I brought Evan home on a cloudy morning, the Oregon sky low and gentle, as if deliberately slowing its pace with mine. My small car carried one more life now, and even though everything had been prepared carefully, I still felt like I was doing something both familiar and entirely new. The car seat in the back had been installed by a young social worker who patiently walked me through every step, as if afraid I might forget how to do something basic. I thanked her and smiled, but inside I knew no set of instructions truly prepares you for this moment. When the tires rolled onto the familiar driveway in front of my house, I turned off the engine and sat still for a few seconds. The house stood there. The same old home with its weathered wooden porch, the north window Nathaniel had repaired during the summer he turned 35. I opened the back door of the car and leaned down to look at Evan. He was asleep, his tiny hands curled, his breathing even. I lifted him out, feeling the true weight of responsibility settle into my arms. As I stepped over the threshold, I realized the house had been silent for far too long, the kind of silence left behind by a place once full of voices, then suddenly stripped of its rhythm. I placed Evan in the new crib by the living room window where the morning light filtered in softly. I stood there watching him, and suddenly the room felt like it had gained another breath. Old age and a newborn are not a gentle combination. I understood that on the very first night. Evan woke at 1 a.m., then 3 a.m., then 5 a.m. I fumbled with the bottle, counting each scoop of formula like I was solving a difficult equation. My back ached. My knees crackled when I bent down to lift him. There were moments when I stood in the kitchen, my hands shaking, wondering if I was pushing myself too far. There were moments of suffocating fear. I laid Evan down in his crib and stared at his chest, waiting for the rise and fall. I checked the room temperature, checked the locks, checked everything so many times that even I could feel myself wearing down. Every small sound outside the porch made me flinch. Every night I slept half awake, ready to spring up at the first sound of his cry. But alongside the exhaustion were moments of healing I never expected. Evan has a small habit. When held close against my chest, he lets out a very soft breath, like a tiny sigh of relief. The first time I heard that sound, I stood completely still for minutes, afraid to move. I realized then that it wasn't only me holding him. He was holding on to me too, in the only way a baby knows how. In the mornings, when sunlight touches the curtains, Evan opens his eyes and looks around with a seriousness that's almost funny. Once he looked at me for a long moment, then slightly curved his lips. Not quite a smile, just the faintest change. But my heart tightened. Nathaniel had that same look when he was little, the look of someone weighing the world before deciding to accept it. There are details that hurt so much I have to turn away. The way Evan wrinkles his nose when he's displeased, the way he grips my finger with surprising strength, even a small mark on his chin, a trace so much like Nathaniel when he turned 2. I don't try to find my son in Evan, but Evan brings those things with him, like an unavoidable reminder. The house slowly came back to life in very tangible ways. The sound of the bottle sterilizer replaced the long silence. The living room light turns on at midnight, no longer to illuminate loneliness, but to make sure a small life is safe. I started opening the windows more often, letting fresh air flow in. I hung the family photo back on the wall, not to cling to the past, but to put it where it belongs. I learned to ask for help. A neighbor brought over a pot of hot soup on my 3rd day home. An old friend came to watch Evan so I could sleep for an hour. I used to think asking for help meant admitting weakness. Now I understand it's the only way to keep going. Some nights I sit in the armchair, Evan asleep on my chest, and I feel something very strange. Imperfect peace. I still think of Nathaniel every day. The pain hasn't disappeared. It's only shifted, making room for a new purpose. I no longer wake up just to get through the day. I wake up because Evan needs me. One afternoon, while I was changing Evan's diaper, he suddenly laughed. A short, high, clumsy sound. I froze, then laughed too, tears spilling without warning. I thought of Nathaniel, of my son's first laughs. And for the first time, that memory didn't bring only pain. It carried continuation. I am no longer alone in the way I once thought was permanent. Loneliness doesn't disappear entirely. It changes shape. It becomes the quiet after Evan falls asleep. It becomes the time I sit by the window, looking at the still lake in the distance, no longer trembling like before. I learned to live with it, without letting it swallow me. Sometimes, when I'm so tired I want to sit on the kitchen floor and cry, I wonder if I made the right choice. Then Evan wakes up, needing me, and the question fades. Not because I have a perfect answer, but because I have something to do. I began making very small plans, a regular medical schedule, a foster parent support class the social worker recommended, a small corner of the garden to plant flowers in the spring. These plans aren't promises for a distant future. They're stakes driven into the present, keeping me upright. This house has witnessed too much loss, but now it also witnesses a beginning. Not loud, not dramatic, just day by day, night by night, the steady breathing of a child growing up safe. When I hold Evan by the window on a quiet evening, I whisper to him, not expecting him to understand. "You have a home," I say, not because everything is okay, but because we will make it okay. The house is no longer a place where I live alone with memories. It becomes the place where I learn to keep living, without denying the pain, but without letting the pain define the rest of my life. And in Evan's steady breathing, I find the sense of purpose I thought I had lost with my son. No longer alone, not because loneliness vanished, but because, at last, I have someone to walk with, even though the road ahead is still long. Time doesn't arrive like a great wave that washes everything away. It comes slowly, day by day, quiet and patient, like water soaking into dry earth. Evan grew that way, not suddenly, not loudly, but steadily, so much so that sometimes I only noticed when a shirt had grown too tight, when the once fragile cries turned into curious babbling sounds. Evan is healthy. That is the first thing, and also the most important. The doctors said his lungs have fully recovered, with no lasting effects from those early days between life and death. Every time I hear that, I nod and say thank you, but inside I whisper a different thanks. a thank you meant for Nathaniel. My son never lived to see this, but I believe he traded his life so Evan could have that chance. Our mornings start early. Evan wakes when the first light slips through the curtains. No alarm needed. I learn to shape my rhythm around his. Meals, naps, small playtimes on the old rug in the living room. I thought I had forgotten all of this after Nathaniel grew up, but it turns out the body and the heart have their own memory. My hands know how to support his head. My voice naturally lowers when I rock him to sleep. I am mothering again, not to replace the past, but to carry it forward. When Evan began to say his first words, I knew I would have to face a question I had postponed for a long time. He asked it naturally, one quiet afternoon, as we sat together on the porch, watching leaves fall. "Where's Dad?" Evan asked, his voice small but clear. I took a slow breath. I had prepared for this moment, but no preparation is ever enough. I didn't want to lie. I also didn't want to place a burden on a child. "Your dad was a very good man," I said. "He loved you, even though he never got to meet you." Evan tilted his head, thinking, "Where is Dad?" "He's in our hearts," I answered, placing my hand on my chest, then on his. "And in the good things he left behind." I tell Evan about Nathaniel in small pieces, appropriate to his childhood. I tell him about a man who liked fixing things around the house, who liked laughing when he solved a difficult problem, who liked sitting by the lake fishing on quiet afternoons. I don't tell him about the warehouse, the gun, the cold water. Those truths will come later, when Evan is old enough to understand without being crushed by them. The past is still there. There are days when I open a drawer and find something of Nathaniel's, his old watch, a note he wrote, and the sharp pain returns, as vivid as the first day, but it no longer controls me. I don't let it decide how I live that day. I learn to place the pain in its own space, to respect it, without letting it steer my life. I am stronger, not in a loud way. My strength comes from getting up every morning, even when my back aches, from signing another stack of legal papers, even when my hand is tired, from facing the curious looks of strangers without needing to explain everything. I no longer feel the need to prove anything. I know I'm doing what's right. Some evenings, when Evan is fast asleep, I sit alone in the living room, the warm yellow light falling on the photos on the wall. Nathaniel on his graduation day, Nathaniel on his wedding day, and now Evan in oversized pajamas, smiling at the world. I look at those three images and see an unbroken current. My son is no longer here in flesh and bone, but his love remains, clearer and more tangible than ever. Evan is proof of that. Every time he laughs, every time he falls and stands back up, I see Nathaniel there, not as a ghost of loss, but as part of a life that continues. I don't have to imagine it. I only have to look. Someone once asked me, during one of those rare conversations, if I had any regrets. Regret for not turning away when I heard the sound by the lake. Regret for stepping into a dangerous chain of events. Regret for choosing the hardest path. I answered immediately without thinking. No, I don't regret it. Not because everything ended perfectly, because it didn't and never will. I don't regret it because if I could return to that moment, I would still run down to the lake. I would still pull the suitcase out. I would still choose Evan, no matter the cost. Time does not erase blood ties. It doesn't make me forget Nathaniel, and I don't want to forget him. It only teaches me how to carry that memory without collapsing under it. It teaches me that love doesn't end when someone is gone. It changes shape, finding another way to exist. When I hold Evan by the lake on a peaceful morning, the water calm as if it never witnessed tragedy, I whisper something only I can hear. "Your dad brought you here," I say, "and I'll stay for as long as I can." Evan doesn't understand everything. He only grips my hand tightly as children do. But in that grip, I feel a bond time cannot erase, a thread woven from blood, from choice, from unconditional love. I lost my son, but I did not lose my ability to love. and as long as Evan grows up. In those arms, I know I am living, not in the past, but in its meaningful continuation. I still remember that moment clearly, even though enough time has passed for everything around it to change. The lake that day was not violent at all. It was still, almost gentle, reflecting the pale gray sky of what seemed like an ordinary afternoon. If someone had looked from a distance, they would have seen nothing but calm water, a few small ripples, and wind moving through the trees. But I know that just one step more, and I could have turned away. If I had chosen to stay in the kitchen, pretending I heard nothing, if I had convinced myself it was just a harmless sound, not worth an older woman like me taking a risk. If I had chosen familiar safety over a vague instinct, just one different choice, and everything would have gone down a path with no return. If I had turned away, Evan would be gone. There would have been no suitcase pulled from the water, no faint breathing heard in that decisive moment, no emergency call, no ambulance lights, no long days in the hospital, no sleepless nights of fear and hope. Evan would have been only a name no one ever knew, a life erased before it could exist in anyone's memory. And so would I. There are losses that don't kill you immediately, but leave you living on like a shadow. If I had turned away that day, I would have lived the rest of my life with a question that never had an answer. Every time I looked at the lake, I would have wondered, what if I had run down? I would have carried that weight to the end of my days, heavier even than the pain of losing Nathaniel. People often think courage means having no fear. The truth is different. I was terrified. I was afraid of falling, afraid of the cold, afraid of facing something too terrible to endure. I was even afraid that I might be wrong, afraid it was all a misunderstanding that would make me look foolish. But love was stronger than that fear. Not loud love, not the bravery of the young. It was the quiet love of a mother who had already lost a child, who understood that some things, if you don't do them in that moment, you never get another chance. It was love without promises, without guarantees, simply the force that pushes you forward even when your legs are shaking. That love was stronger than age. I've heard many people talk about the limits of old age, that we should slow down, stay safe, let others handle difficult things. Maybe they're right in many cases. But age does not take away the ability to choose what's right. It doesn't erase the responsibility of the heart, and it certainly doesn't make love weaker. There are days when I'm very tired. My back hurts. My hands shake. Some mornings, it takes me longer to get out of bed, but not once have I thought I was too old to love, too old to protect, or too old to do what needed to be done. That love was also stronger than evil. Evil often appears reasonable. It has reasons. It has motives. It calls itself a solution. Lysanne believed what she did was necessary to protect her own life. She chose to erase whatever stood in her way. But evil, no matter how many layers of logic it wears, cannot withstand the light when the truth is pulled up. Just like that suitcase years ago forced to rise to the surface. I didn't defeat evil with strength or exceptional intelligence. I simply didn't turn away. I chose to run toward the sound, toward the thing that frightened me most. And that choice changed everything. Now, when I stand by the lake on quiet mornings, I look at the water without trembling as before. I don't forget what happened. I don't want to forget. But the memory is no longer an open wound. It becomes a reminder that in this life there are very brief moments when your choice determines not only someone else's fate, but how you will live with yourself afterward. Evan runs around the yard, his laughter filling the air. He doesn't know his life once hung on a few seconds. He only knows there is a home, a pair of arms, and a world safe enough for him to grow up in. And that is enough. I chose not to turn back, not because I was certain I would win, not because I thought I was stronger than others, but because I knew that if I didn't step forward, I would never forgive myself. There are choices you can't redo. And looking back on the road behind me, with all the loss, the fear, and even the small miracles, I know I chose right. Not because of the outcome, but because of the reason I walked forward. If you're still here, listening all the way to these final lines, I want to thank you, not as a viewer, but as someone who has walked with me through the entire journey. Tell me where you're watching this story from. A busy city, a small town, or a quiet place you call home. And I want to ask you something, honestly. If it were you, in that moment by the lake, when everything was still uncertain and frightening, would you run toward the sound? Or would you turn away, like so many of us have done in life? Leave a comment. It doesn't have to be long, just real. I read every line, and I believe your story deserves to be heard too. If you see yourself in this story, in the fear, in the choice, in unconditional love, please press like and stay with me by subscribing to the channel, because there are still many stories left untold, and maybe one of them will help someone out there find the courage not to turn back.
"Don't open the door, teach her how to save water." My daughter-in-law spat those cruel words as she turned the lock, trapping me in the bathroom for 2 days in the very house I had bought with my own sweat and blood. Outside, my son calmly turned on the TV, leaned back in his chair, and laughed, as if his mother's humiliation were nothing more than cheap entertainment. I shivered inside a damp towel, no food, no chair, just the cold tile floor and the steady drip of water. While I curled up in the dark, they ate dinner and laughed together, unaware that in that exact moment I had made a decision. I would take everything back, and that would be the last peaceful dinner they'd ever have in this house. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. I'm Lila Whitmore, 71 years old, living in Virginia. I once thought old age would bring me peace, mornings making coffee in my own kitchen, listening to sparrows outside the window, and sometimes visiting church on Sundays. But peace only comes when you stop placing your trust in the wrong people. I never imagined I'd be locked in a bathroom by my own daughter-in-law like a criminal. I never imagined my only son, the child I held through freezing nights, whose forehead I kissed every time he had a fever, could sit there, casually turn up the TV, hear the click of a lock, and laugh. A small laugh, buried under TV commercials, that still stabs my heart every time I remember it. That bathroom was small, cold, and damp. I had only a towel around me, my hair still dripping. The chill from the tile seeped into my back and legs, making my knees ache. I leaned against the wall, staring at the dim light leaking under the door. No chair, no food, just the steady drip of the faucet and the clink of silverware outside the everyday rhythm of people who had forgotten their humanity. I didn't cry. I've cried plenty in my life: when my husband died, when I lost my job, when I sold our old car to pay my son's hospital bill. But this time I stayed quiet. I knew tears don't wake anyone up. They only make you weaker. I rested my head against the wall and closed my eyes, letting memories pour in. Over 40 years ago, my husband Edward and I worked ourselves to the bone to buy this house. A small place in the suburbs of Richmond, 2 bedrooms, an apple tree in the backyard, and a white fence Edward painted himself. When he died of heart disease, I swore I'd keep this house at any cost, because it was the last piece of us left. I never imagined it would become my prison. I remember the day Cole brought Alyssa over. She was young, pretty, and smart, the kind of woman any man would want beside him. I was happy my son had found someone good. I welcomed her with an apple pie Edward used to love, and Alyssa beamed and hugged me. I didn't know then it would be the last time she was sincere. In the first months after they married, they lived with me because they couldn't afford a place yet. I didn't mind. I said, "This house is yours. Think of it as a start." I didn't mention the deed was still in my name, not from suspicion, but because I didn't think I needed to guard myself from family. I was the mother, and that was my son. Looking back now, that thinking was both naive and foolish. Things changed gradually. At first, Alyssa made small comments. "Mom, you leave the lights on too much." Or, "This dish smells too strong." I nodded, smiled, and figured she liked things tidy. But then her words got sharper. "She still thinks this is her house." I heard it as I passed the kitchen. Cole stayed silent. He neither defended his mother nor pushed back on his wife, just silence. And silence can be crueler than words. I lived in the same house but felt more and more like an uninvited guest. I tried to keep the peace, cooking and doing laundry for myself, avoiding their dinner hour. When they went to work, I weeded the backyard and trimmed the roses. Once, I repainted the fence Edward left behind. Cole stepped out, looked at me and said coldly, "Mom, you're too loud. I'm trying to rest." I turned back, smiled softly, and apologized. But something cracked inside me. That night I couldn't sleep. I looked around my small room, the wedding photo of me and Edward, the wooden box with the house papers, an old safe, only I knew the combination to. I brushed my hand over the deed and thought, I'm still the owner of this house. Then I gave a bitter little smile. Owner? An owner who has to whisper in the dark just to remember she still has any rights? 2 days later, everything blew up over a hot shower. I'd been fixing the fence all afternoon. It was cold. The air smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves. When I finished, my back ached and my hands trembled. I went to shower just to let warm water soothe my old shoulders. 10 minutes, only 10 minutes. The first pounding on the door startled me. "How long are you going to be?" Alyssa's voice snapped, sharp and hard. I answered, "Just a moment, I'm almost done." Silence. A few seconds later, the lock clicked. I spun around, grabbed the handle, and pulled. It didn't budge. I pounded on the door and called Cole's name. No answer. The TV got louder. I heard silverware clinking. Laughter. I stood still. My heart raced, but my mind suddenly felt strangely calm. I wrapped the towel around me and sat on the cold tile, watching the water spread in irregular streaks. I could hear my own breathing slow and steady, like I was counting the minutes. I tried calling out once more. No response, only the sitcom laughs from the living room. When the imaginary clock in my head finished its first full circle, I knew more than an hour had passed. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. I didn't understand what I was being punished for, using water or simply existing. That first night, I curled up in the dark, listening to the pipes knock like a heartbeat. The old smell of tile, dampness, and leftover soap mixed together. I drank from the faucet, the metallic taste cold and bitter. I bit my lip so I wouldn't cry. On the second day, my head swam, my lips cracked, my hands went numb. I heard Alyssa walk by. Her voice drifted back. She must have learned her lesson. Cole said nothing. Not one objection. Not one question about whether I was even alive. But in the hunger and the humiliation, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I've lived through loss, through the loneliness of widowhood, through freezing nights without enough heat. Nothing could break me. No one could keep me locked up forever, especially not in my own house. And when the door opened on the morning of the third day, Alyssa looked at me blankly and said, "Next time, learn to save." Cole stood behind her, avoiding my eyes. I just nodded. No words. No tears. I walked past them, hair wet, bare feet, back to my room. I shut the door and took a deep breath. On the table was the safe key. Morning light fell across the desk and lit up the framed deed. I smiled, not with bitterness, but with someone who had just found her strength again. I whispered to myself, "You turned the lock, but I'm the one holding the key." And from that moment on, the quiet plan to leave and take everything back began to form. I still remember that February morning air, so cold it cut the skin, frost on the porch, and the phone ringing at 5 a.m. The doctor on the line, voice hoarse, said that Edward, my husband, didn't survive his second heart attack. I sat frozen at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of me that suddenly tasted like nothing. The house felt too big, too quiet. Down the hall, Cole, only 8 years old, slept soundly, unaware that from that day on our world had changed forever. I watched him breathe, his little cheeks rising and falling, and whispered a promise I've never broken. I will not let you go hungry. I will not let you. I feel alone. That vow kept me standing through every year that followed. I packed away my tears, dried my face, and the next day went out to find work. In the mornings, I cleaned a small office downtown. Hands used to holding a soup ladle now pushed a mop. The smell of cleaning chemicals stuck to my hair and skin, impossible to wash off even after 2 showers. In the afternoons, I worked the register at a corner store, standing 10 hours, smiling at every customer even as my feet swelled. At night, I did mending under a dim yellow lamp, stitches blurring as my eyes burned. Every time I looked at our wedding photo on the wall, I told myself, it's okay, as long as Cole has enough food and books. There were winter days when snow slowed the buses, and I got home near midnight. My fingers numb, lips cracked, but the moment I heard my boy whisper, "Mom?" the house felt warm again. I lit the stove, reheated the soup, and split the meal, the only piece of meat always in Cole's bowl. Mine was just broth and a few slices of potato. I never felt deprived. Watching him eat well made me feel full. Years later, I can still smell the wood burning in the fireplace, hear the spoons scraping the pot, feel his small hand on mine as he said, "Mom, I'll take care of you someday." Promise. I believed him with all my heart. I gave up small things women enjoy: new clothes, lipstick, a salon visit to spare a few more dollars for my son. When Cole hit high school and wanted to play baseball, I picked up an overnight warehouse shift to buy him a glove and cleats. Every time I saw him suited up on the field, pride brought me to tears. I thought, if Edward were here, he'd be smiling just like I was. Every birthday, even when I barely had anything left, I baked him a little cake. Once, I scraped together leftover flour, mixed in some sugar, and used our old rusty oven. When I lit the candle, he blew it out and grinned. "Mom, this is the best cake in the world." I laughed and turned away so he wouldn't see my tears of happiness. I thought, as long as he grows up kind, every sacrifice is worth it. But life rarely plays fair. After Cole went to college, I thought I could rest a bit. Tuition cost more than I imagined. I didn't want him buried in debt. I picked up a morning cleaning job at the library and a temporary cashier shift at a small neighborhood supermarket. At night, I did extra mending and fixed neighbors' jeans. Some mornings I fell asleep at the kitchen table, a spoon's imprint on my cheek. But when I read his letters from school, telling me his GPA was high, I found the strength to keep going. I only wished that one day Cole would graduate, find a good job, start a family, and be able to take care of himself. At graduation, I sat in the stands, clutching his diploma in its wrinkled envelope. I cried tears of joy, because everything I'd worked for had taken shape. I thought maybe Edward was watching from somewhere, smiling. After the ceremony, Cole hugged me tight. I still remember that hug, heartbeat for heartbeat. "Mom, I'm here because of you." I thought those words would stay with me for life, but maybe that was the moment I made my mistake. I thought love and sacrifice naturally grow gratitude. I didn't know that when kindness has no boundaries, it teaches others to see it as obligation. In the years after Cole started working, I still didn't slow down. I kept waking at 5 a.m., making coffee and breakfast, waiting for his footsteps on the stairs. I still asked, "What do you want to eat?" like he was still 8. I didn't realize I'd raised in him the habit of being served, not the habit of sharing. I still remember the dinner when Cole turned 30. He brought Alyssa over to meet me. I cooked all day, pot roast, salad, pie, the dishes Edward used to love. When they arrived, I was waiting at the door, hands still dusty with flour. Alyssa hugged me and said sweetly, "Mom, Lila, Cole says you're the best cook in the city." I laughed, warmth flooding my chest. I thought, how wonderful my son has found someone who appreciates him. But during that meal, when I put a piece of meat on Cole's plate, Alyssa gently set her hand on mine and said, in a voice soft as a feather, "Mom, let me take care of him, okay?" I nodded, thinking nothing of it. But that night, for the first time, I noticed my own plate was untouched when they had already finished eating. I'd been busy watching my son, busy talking, and forgot to eat. No one noticed. And strangely, that very dinner was when I first felt I was missing my share. In the years after Cole married Alyssa, I kept thinking she just needed time to adjust. I believed love would help people understand one another. I thought if I gave a little more, the family would be peaceful. I never imagined that very willingness to yield would teach them how to keep pushing the line. Once, a neighbor said to me, "Mrs. Lila, you're too gentle." When kids get used to being pampered, they start treating it like a right. I only smiled. He's my only son. How could I be angry with him? Looking back now, I see I was wrong from that very moment. I thought I could use affection to fight selfishness, use tolerance to dissolve ingratitude. But kindness without boundaries is nothing more than an invitation for others to step over yours. All those years of working myself to exhaustion, I never imagined the money I sweated for, the pieces of cake I split to save for my son, would one day become someone else's fancy dinner, one where I no longer had a seat. I spent my life making sure Cole lacked nothing: food, clothes, love. What I failed to teach him was how to value those things. And maybe that was the first mistake that led to all the tragedies that followed. Cole's wedding took place on an early summer afternoon in the little backyard where Edward had built a wooden swing for our boy when he was 5. I spent a whole month preparing, repainting the fence, trimming the apple tree, washing every curtain. I wanted everything perfect for my son's big day. Cole wore a navy suit and looked mature and confident. Alyssa, in a simple, elegant white dress, made my heart pinch a little. She was so beautiful, radiant, as if every light pointed toward her. When the music started, I stood in the very last row, holding a small bouquet. I watched my son walk down the aisle, eyes shining, and told myself, "You've truly grown up." In that moment, I believed every hardship, every year of toil had meaning. After the ceremony at the small backyard reception, Cole took my hand and said, "Mom, I wouldn't be here without you." I smiled, and for a moment all the tired years melted away. I looked around the house where his childhood laughter once echoed and knew I was about to hand it to the next generation. When the guests had left, I placed an envelope on the dining table inside were the house papers. I said, "This house is yours. I want you two to have a solid start." Alyssa froze, eyes brimming, and Cole hugged me tight. But there was one thing I didn't say. The deed was still in my name. Not because I didn't trust my son, but because Edward's old attorney had once advised me to keep ownership until necessary. He called it a legal spare key for when life doesn't go as planned. At the time, I never thought I'd need it. I moved into the small room at the end of the hallway, where light only slipped in through a tiny window facing the backyard. I brought a few of my things: Edward's armchair, the wooden box of documents, and our wedding photo. I wanted the young couple to have their own space. I cooked for myself, did my own laundry, and tried to keep myself small and quiet, like a guest renting a room in my own house. At first, Alyssa was very sweet. She called me Mom, asked what I liked to eat, even made me a cup of afternoon tea now and then. I thought I was lucky to have such a considerate daughter-in-law. I helped them decorate the living room, reorganize the kitchen, tidy the yard, and felt happy to still be useful. Then the gentle words shifted into constant little reminders. Mom, could you turn the TV off earlier? It's a bit loud. Mom, this bone broth smells great, but the scent spreads all over the house. Or, Mom, your slippers are a little off, I'm afraid someone might trip. At first, I didn't mind. I figured she just wanted the place neat. But when those comments repeated day after day, I began to feel like a clumsy guest in the very place I had built. Cole, as usual, chose silence. Whenever I looked a little down or drifted away, he only said, Mom, don't worry about it. Alyssa's just particular. I just want a peaceful house. I heard let it go to keep the peace so often it became routine. I tried to be patient. I got up earlier, turned off the TV sooner, cooked separate dishes with less smell. I always believed silence kept the peace. I'd been through a long marriage. I knew when to avoid conflict. But silence, stretched too long, becomes an invisible wall, and once it's up, it's hard to tear down. One evening, I heard Alyssa on the phone in the living room, her voice sweet but tinged with fatigue. You know, living with your mother-in-law isn't easy. She's nice, but it still feels like this is her house. I stood still behind the door, dish towel in hand. I wasn't angry. I just felt cold. Yes, this house was mine. But her words made me realize in her eyes, I was someone who'd stayed too long and refused to leave. I pulled back. I avoided the living room, cooked when they were at work, cleaned when they slept. At dinner, I'd leave my portion on the table and eat later in my room. I didn't want anyone to have to put up with my presence anymore. Sometimes Cole came into my room, sat down, and asked a few polite questions. Mom, you doing okay? Do you need anything? I always answered, I'm fine. I didn't want to bother him. But the painful truth was that the warm bond between us had thinned into pure obligation. I still remember a late night while I was folding laundry. Alyssa walked in, her usual small smile gone. Mom, I think we should do our own laundry. Thank you, but we want to get used to doing it ourselves. I nodded and swallowed a sigh. After she left, I stared at the half-folded clothes. For the first time in years, I felt truly unnecessary. Even so, I kept my Sunday morning tea habit. I made 3 cups and set them on the kitchen table. 2 always stayed full. One morning, Alyssa looked at me, smiled, and said, light but sharp, Mom, you don't have to worry about that. Cole and I will get coffee out. You should rest. The door closed, leaving 2 cups of tea to go cold. I sat down and watched the steam disappear, my heart feeling hollow. A neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, once stopped by and saw me sweeping the porch. She said, Mrs. Lila, the house is lively now, but why do I rarely see them talk with you? I forced a smile. Young people are busy, Mrs. Peterson. They have their own lives. It sounded calm, but only I knew how tight my throat felt saying it. At night, I sat in Edward's old armchair, watching the living room light leak through the door crack. I could hear them talking, laughing, sometimes discussing remodel plans. Once, Alyssa said, if we knock out the wall by the room at the end of the hall, the bedroom will be bigger. The room at the end of the hall, my room. I heard Cole answer softly, It's okay. Mom will want her own place eventually. My chest tightened, but I still didn't cry. I just clasped my hands together like I was holding on to the last of my dignity. I used to think love was the strongest bond, but love can rot in silence like an old boat that doesn't split open, just slowly takes on water until it sinks. I chose silence because I was afraid of losing my son. I was afraid that speaking up would crack everything beyond repair. I didn't realize that one person's silence is often mistaken by others as consent. And that supposed consent made them believe they could say and do anything, even lock me in a bathroom for 2 full days, inside a house where every brick bears my fingerprints. On the first autumn evening after their wedding, I flipped on the hallway light like always. With age, my eyesight has faded, so when I go to the kitchen at night, I leave a small lamp on a soft yellow glow that keeps me from tripping. But that night, the light snapped off the moment I stepped out. From the living room, Alyssa's voice came steady and cold. "Electricity isn't free, Mom." I froze. The words weren't loud, but they fell into my ears like steady drops on stone, not strong enough to break it, but sharp enough to sting. I smiled faintly, telling myself she was just reminding me. I didn't respond, just slipped back to my bed, an emptiness I couldn't explain spreading inside me. The next morning, I made tea early. The water was warm, not hot like usual. I tried to turn up the heater but realized the temperature had been lowered. When I asked, Alyssa just smiled. "I adjusted it to save energy, Mom. Good for the environment." I nodded and didn't argue. I like saving too. But in her voice I heard something else, as if I'd been lectured, not included. Little things like that kept popping up, like pebbles tossed into a still pond. I folded their bath towels. Alyssa opened them, refolded, and said gently, "Mom, these should be folded in thirds, not halves." I loaded the washer. She told me I used the wrong amount of water. I started the dishwasher. She frowned. "Mom, plates should go in straight rows, not at an angle. The water won't reach evenly." Each time, I apologized, smiled, and said, "I'll remember." I thought I was keeping the peace, but the way Alyssa nodded, pursed her lips, and turned away made me feel like a clumsy housemaid, not the homeowner. That night, as I passed the hall, I overheard them in the kitchen. "She still thinks this is her house." Alyssa's voice wasn't overtly mean, just tired. But that "still thinks" sliced deep. I leaned against the wall and swallowed hard. I wanted to walk in, smile, and say, "Yes, it is my house." But I couldn't. I just stood there, listening to pans clatter and sauce simmer, then went back to my room and closed the door softly. The next morning, I went to the yard. I cut the grass, wiped the patio table, and replaced the faucet gasket, little jobs Edward used to do. Sweat stuck to my shirt and my hands ached, but in the work I felt useful. When Alyssa came home, I greeted her with a smile and said, "I changed the leaky kitchen gasket so the water runs stronger now." She gave a short reply. "Oh, Mom, you don't need to do that. We were going to call a repairman." Then she headed straight upstairs. I stood there looking at my hands' thin, calloused fingers, nails stained with rubber dust. I didn't understand why my kindness now seemed to annoy people. I realized Alyssa had started setting little rules. First it was lights, then water, then food. She said, "Mom, don't buy whole milk anymore. Cole and I only drink almond. Please get your own kind so there's no mix-ups." I nodded. I only need a little milk for my morning tea, but that "so there's no mix-ups" felt like a label slapped on me. Another day, she taped a sheet to the fridge. "House rules: keep it clean, save resources, respect personal space." At the bottom were both their signatures. I stared at that paper for a long time. It didn't mention me, but it felt like it was speaking directly to me. Cole was the same, silent. His silence had its own tone. Not indifference, but compromise. Every time I tried to bring something up, he just smiled. "Mom, Alyssa worries about small stuff. Don't take it to heart." I couldn't tell whether to be sad that my son wouldn't defend me or sad that he thought I was too weak to defend myself. I started storing everything in my memory, each look, each tone, each sigh. Not to hold a grudge, but to stop lying to myself that things would get better. I've spent years waiting for things to get better, and I know that if you don't stop the bad, it only gets worse. One evening, Alyssa invited friends over for dinner. I wasn't told ahead of time. When I came downstairs, she'd already set the table, scented candles burning, soft jazz playing. I smiled and said, "Oh, a party?" Let me help set up. She shook her head, still smiling. No need, Mom. Please relax, we've got it. I turned away, but as I reached the stairs, I heard one of her friends whisper, You live with your mother-in-law? Alyssa laughed, a hint of mockery. Yeah, but she's so gentle you almost don't notice she's around. The group burst out laughing. I froze on the step, hand gripping the banister. Almost don't notice she's around sounded like a compliment, but it smelled of erasure. After the party, they laughed and talked late into the night. I couldn't sleep. I heard glasses clinking, high heels tapping on the wood floor. I remembered parties years ago, when Cole's friends came over and I baked cookies, poured lemonade, laughter ringing through the house. Now, all I heard was my own breathing in a small room, the hallway light still off. The next morning I went to the kitchen and found the table full of dirty glasses. I washed them all and wiped everything spotless, leaving no trace. When Alyssa woke up, she looked surprised. Mom, you didn't have to do that. I was going to clean up. I just smiled. It's okay, I'm used to getting up early. But from then on, I started watching everything I did. If I did the laundry, she'd redo it. If I cooked something, she'd say they already ate out. I was turning into a shadow in my own house. Another night, I heard Cole and Alyssa talking in the living room. The door wasn't fully closed, and I clearly heard Alyssa say, I just feel uncomfortable with her staying here forever. This is our home, but everything still feels arranged by her. Even the way it smells is hers. Cole answered softly, I know, but I don't want to hurt my mom. Alyssa let out a light laugh. Hurt her? She probably doesn't even notice. I went back to my room and shut the door. I sat on the bed and stared at the ceiling. I didn't cry, but something inside me, a small, quiet part, snapped. The next day, I stopped turning on the hallway light. I walked in the dark, one hand tracing the wall. I didn't want to hear electricity isn't free again. I didn't run the water heater too long, didn't fold towels the way I always had, didn't use scented fabric softener. I lived like a renter, tiptoeing in the very house I paid for. But from that point on, something else began to form in me, a clear, alert record. I remembered not to resent, but to stop deceiving myself with Alyssa's just tired or Cole's stuck in the middle. No, I understood. People who've been loved too much often never learn to value it. I looked back at what I'd done, gifting the house, cooking, quietly helping, and realized my overkindness might have taught them they had the right to look down on me. I didn't react, argue, or raise my voice. I simply noted every sign of contempt, like someone collecting evidence even they don't yet realize they're producing. Because deep down, I knew every slight, no matter how small, is a warning before the storm. And I, Lila Whitmore, had started to hear the wind rise. That afternoon, the wind swept through the backyard, carrying the smell of dry leaves and damp soil. I stood by the wooden fence, rubber mallet in hand, trying to replace a few warped boards after last week's rain. Fall in Virginia always has a sneaky chill, not enough to bite but enough to swell the joints so that every strike of the nail sent a sting up my wrist. I worked slowly, carefully, the way Edward used to. He always told me, "Don't let things sit broken too long. Lila, fix them while you can." When I set the last board, the sun had slipped behind the trees, leaving a wash of pale orange across the ground. The wind turned sharper, my back burned, my calloused hands stiffened. I took a deep breath, inhaled the scent of fresh-cut wood, and went inside. My whole body ached, sweat and dust clinging to my shirt. All I could think about was a hot shower to loosen my tight shoulders. The bathroom was small, steam fogging the mirror quickly. I turned on the warm water and stood still, letting it run down my back slowly, like it was washing away months of silence layered over the house. Not even 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps growing heavy in the hall. The first pounding hit like thunder. "How much longer, Mom?" Alyssa's voice cold and sharp as steel. I startled and answered through the steam. "Just a moment, I'm almost done." No reply, only a sigh. Then a few seconds later, it came the dry, decisive sound of the lock turning from the outside. I spun around, wet hands shaking on the knob. I pulled hard. Nothing. I called out, "Alyssa, what's going on?" "Open the door." Silence. Only the TV from the living room, silverware clinking, laughter. I called louder, this time to Cole. "Cole, do you hear me? Open the door for Mom." No answer. Just a short laugh, then a sitcom theme swelling. I pounded the door over and over, only to get the dull clank of metal in return. The door felt colder than the water on my skin. I stood still, chest heaving, stunned and disbelieving. For a moment I wanted to think it was a mistake, a prank, or some lesson they thought I needed. But minute after long minute, I knew this wasn't a joke. I wrapped the towel around me and sat on the floor. The tile was freezing, damp soaking through the towel and into my bones. I listened to them chat outside Alyssa's even tone, Cole's responses like nothing was happening. Every laugh sliced through the trust I'd spent a lifetime protecting. I shouted a few more times. Then I went quiet. Silence wasn't a choice anymore, it was survival. I leaned my head back against the wall, closed my eyes, and tried to breathe slowly. I thought of Edward, of my years as a single mother, of the promise I made long ago. I vowed my son would never go without, never imagined I would be starved and locked up by that very child. Now I understood the cruelest betrayal isn't shouting, it's absolute indifference. That first night, all I had was the cold trickle from the faucet. I drank a few sips, the metallic tang sharp and bitter. Hunger twisted my stomach, but I didn't knock again. I sat still, listening to the fridge door close, footsteps passing by. They went to bed. The whole house fell silent. I curled up on the tile, my back throbbing, my heartbeat fading. I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the pipes reminded me I was being held. Once I heard Cole walk by, keys jingling, then stop outside the bathroom. I thought he would open the door. He didn't. A few seconds of quiet, then his footsteps drifted away. By morning, a sliver of light slipped under the door. My head felt heavy, lips dry, hands shaking. I forced myself up and looked in the mirror, hair a mess, hollow cheeks, red eyes. I gave a thin smile. A mother locked in her own house. Who would believe it? I called out again. No response. I heard dishes, smelled coffee drifting in through the crack. Then the front door slammed. They left for work. I was alone with the silence. The bathroom became my whole world, small, cramped, and cold. I had no clock, so I counted time by my heartbeat and the number of cars passing outside. By noon, I slid to the floor, dizzy with hunger. I pressed my forehead to the cold wall and closed my eyes, trying to steady myself. Alyssa's words from the day before looped in my head. She still thinks this is her house. Yes, I did think so. Maybe that's exactly why I was being kept like an intruder. By evening, I heard them return, the door opening, footsteps, then familiar laughter. I wanted to scream, to pound the door until my hands bled, but I didn't. I stayed still. There's no point explaining to people who don't want to hear. On the second night, my stomach growled in waves. I drank from the tap to dull the hunger. Wind hissed through the tiny window above, cold air raising goosebumps on my skin. I trembled, but didn't cry. I thought how strange it is that people become clearest when pushed to their limits. I remembered the factory days when I was young, hands raw and still smiling, thinking as long as my boy was okay, it was enough. I'd lived my whole life for other people and never thought about defending myself. But here, in this mildewed bathroom, I understood. If I didn't stand up and reclaim my dignity, all those years would mean nothing. When I closed my eyes, I saw Edward in my mind. He stood by the fence, smiling. "Lila, don't let anyone treat you like you don't matter." I opened my eyes. My palms were cold, but my heart felt strangely warm. I wasn't afraid anymore. I didn't beg. I didn't pound the door. I let time pass, let them think I'd surrendered. In the silence, I made a plan. If they used a lock to teach me to save, I would use the law to teach them limits. I started observing the time the door opened each morning, the jingle of keys on the table, when they left, when their steps returned at night. I stored every detail in my head. I would need it later. On the morning of the third day, the lock clicked again, this time in reverse. The door cracked and light slipped in. Alyssa appeared, phone in hand, her voice casual like nothing had happened. "Next time, don't waste water, Mom." She turned away without waiting for an answer. Cole stood in the living room with his back to me. No look, no concern. I stepped out, water dripping from my hair, feet freezing on the floor. I walked past them like a ghost, back to my room, and shut the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, fingers touching the old safe key. The first feeling wasn't anger, it was clarity. A frightening kind of clarity, the kind that lets you see exactly where the limits of your tolerance end. I don't know how long I sat there. I only know that when the morning light slanted through the curtain, I had a clear decision. There would not be a second time. I wouldn't say anything. I wouldn't cry, wouldn't tell the neighbors, wouldn't beg Cole to realize his mistake. I used to believe in family ties, but from now on, I believe in justice. If they think they can lock me up in this house, they've forgotten the owner of this house is still me. On the third morning, the lock turned with a short, dry, decisive click. The door opened and light rushed in, making me blink. The early chill swept into the bathroom, mixed with the smell of old soap and mildew. Alyssa stood in the doorway, hair tied back, phone in hand, voice even and flat. "Next time, don't waste water, Mom." No guilty look. No apology, just a sentence that fell light as dust and heavy as lead. Cole stood behind her, leaning on the wall, eyes glued to the TV. As I walked past, he didn't look up or say a word. For a second, I saw his hand clench the remote, knuckles white, and then release like nothing happened. I didn't speak, didn't look, didn't let them see a drop of water on my face. I wrapped the towel tight, walked down the long hallway, each step on the cold floor, feeling like I was leaving a prison. I didn't look back. No one deserved to see my eyes then, not angry, not hurt, but utterly indifferent. In my room, I sat down, opened the small drawer. The safe key lay still in my palm, its dull metallic shine catching the morning light. That cold metal felt like it was breathing with me. I took a deep breath and felt my heartbeat slow and steady. I pulled a small sheet of paper from the desk and carefully wrote 5 lines, neat and firm. 1. Confirm ownership. 2. Call the lawyer. 3. Find a discreet buyer. 4. Create my own account. 5. Disappear. I folded the paper in half and tucked it into Edward's old notebook between 2 yellowed pages. It wasn't a revenge list. It was a survival plan. That morning, I made tea like usual. Alyssa and Cole ate in silence, spoons tapping porcelain with a sound like metal scraping glaze. I set the kettle on the table and asked, "Cole, it's cold today. Remember your coat?" He just nodded, eyes never leaving his phone. Alyssa sipped her coffee, glanced at me, and looked away. "No, thank you." I still smiled, calm as if nothing had happened. The chill in that house no longer came from the weather, but from the silence of 3 people living together with no connection left. By day, I did everything the same, watering plants, wiping tables, washing dishes. I let the water run just enough, turned lights on and off exactly on schedule, earlier than usual. I followed their rules perfectly, because I understood, if you want to leave quietly, you first play the role of the compliant one. At noon, when they left for work, I shut my door and drew the curtains. I opened the safe, the lock clicked. Soft but loud in the stillness. Inside were the things I'd kept for years: the house title, Edward's life insurance policy, savings book, and several bank statements I'd hidden well, all in my name, clearly signed, fully legal. I held the property certificate in my palm and stared at the bold letters, Lila Whitmore, my signature. At the bottom, strong and even dated nearly 20 years ago, a feeling both wry and peaceful rose in my chest. All these years they lived in my house, but it never truly belonged to them. I read every page, missing nothing. The deed, property tax papers, fire insurance, bank agreements, everything in order. I even found a copy of Edward's old insurance policy. I thought it was lost. In the margin, he had once written a small note by hand, "For Lila, who knows the value of effort more than anyone." I touched that line lightly. A small smile came to my lips, not happiness, but the smile of someone who's found her backbone again. By afternoon, I walked to the post office. On the way, leafless trees shook in the wind, and my shoes knocked against the pavement, slow but steady. I emailed Edward's old lawyer. He was still alive, still working at a small office near the courthouse. I didn't explain everything, just wrote briefly, "I want to reconfirm the property ownership registered in 2005. Please check it for me as soon as possible." That evening, I got home before they did and cooked a small pot of chicken soup, fragrant with celery and black pepper. When Alyssa walked in, she seemed surprised by the smell but said nothing. I set 3 bowls on the table and invited them. The silence stretched so long I could hear each tick of the wall clock. I ate slowly without looking at them. With every spoonful, I felt a sheet of ice forming in my chest, cold but firm. Night fell, they shut their door, and I opened the safe again. I took out my small notebook and added details to the plan. 1. Call the lawyer back after his response. 2. Contact the discreet broker, the one who sold Mrs. Peterson's old house. 3. Check the limits for international transfers. 4. Open a separate account under my maiden name, Lila Moore. I paused, staring at the 4 lines, pen still in hand. A tear fell onto the page, not from sadness, but because freedom had begun to sprout. In the days that followed, I kept living as if nothing had changed. I still smiled when I saw them, still asked Cole, "Work okay, son?" Still answered, "Sleep well," when Alyssa tossed out a quick goodnight. But inside, I was no longer the woman afraid to bother anyone, afraid to upset her son. I had become an observer, quiet and clear. On the 4th morning, I received a reply from the law office. The ownership verification was freshly stamped, clearly listing me as the sole owner of the house. I folded it and slipped it into my purse. In that moment, I felt a strange peace, not the thrill of victory, but the calm of someone who has taken back control of her life. That evening, when Alyssa opened the fridge and complained, "Why did you buy so much milk?" I simply answered, "I'm used to it. It'll be gone soon." She didn't realize there was another meaning in it. Soon wasn't just the milk, it was everything between us. Late at night, I tidied my room. I gathered a few essentials: the photo album, Edward's wedding ring, a small jewelry box, a few important papers. I packed everything into a small suitcase, then sat by the bed and listened to the wind at the window frame. In the quiet, I saw something simple. The moment they locked me in the bathroom, they didn't just imprison my body, they unlocked someone else in me. Someone who knows blind patience isn't a virtue, it's self-bondage. Someone who understands some battles don't need shouting, only a signature at the right time. I sat still, looking at my reflection in the mirror. The warm yellow light fell across my face, lines deep around my eyes. But this time I didn't look tired. I saw a woman who had finally woken up after a decades-long sleep. I smiled and placed a hand over my chest, feeling a slow, strong heartbeat. In my mind, the 5 steps glowed as clearly as the old hallway light I once turned off to keep others comfortable. Now I switched it back on, just to light the way for myself. 2 days later, I put on a light gray wool coat, wrapped a dark scarf, and stepped out at 8 a.m. January wind in Virginia sliced through, stinging my cheeks like a reminder. Stay sharp, don't tremble. I called a cab to the law office where Edward had worked with Mr. Harold Benson, the man who helped us write our will, buy the house, and keep our documents straight for 20 years. When I walked in, Mr. Benson looked up, surprised. The same kind face, hair nearly all white, thin glasses slipping down his nose. "My goodness, Lila Whitmore, it's been a long time," he said, voice rough but warm. "Edward would be smiling somewhere, knowing you've kept everything this orderly." I gave a small smile and set the file on his desk. "I need you to reconfirm the house ownership. And I may need help selling it quietly." His eyes shifted, not in surprise but in understanding. He opened the file and read every page carefully. After a few minutes, he nodded. "Everything's clean and fully in your name. I'll arrange a private transaction, no sign, no public listing. Just a few weeks to complete." I exhaled lightly, like a knot had been loosened from my throat. He looked up with a half smile. "I don't need to know what happened, but if you're going to leave, leave with your head high, and make sure no one knows the closing date." I nodded. "That's exactly what I'll do." Leaving the law office, I stopped by the bank. No one paid attention to an older woman with a small purse and a steady gaze. I opened a brand new account entirely in my name, with only my signature authorized. The clerk asked, "Would you like to link it to your existing accounts?" I smiled and shook my head. "No, thank you. This one is for personal matters." I also requested a small trust account overseas and moved a portion of Edward's old insurance into it, enough to live comfortably for years, but not so much that anyone at home would be suspicious if they saw a statement. From that day on, every morning I withdrew a small amount of cash, no more than $500, just enough to look like ordinary spending. I tucked it into envelopes and hid them at the bottom of my suitcase, cushioned by old sweaters. I once read that when you want to disappear without notice, the key isn't where you go, it's leaving quietly, in steps so reasonable no one notices. I came home as if I'd just run errands. Alyssa was watering plants on the porch. She saw me and said, "Mom, out early today?" I answered lightly. "Went to the bank to pay the car insurance." She just said, "Uh-huh," and turned away. No more questions. Everything went on like that, quiet, steady like a clock. I kept my old routine. Coffee at 7 a.m., watering orchids at 10 a.m., cooking my own meals in the afternoon. I showed them nothing unusual. If anything had changed, it was only the calm in my voice. Every evening, Alyssa chatted on the phone in the kitchen. She often mentioned remodel plans. One day, while I was stacking dishes, she said to someone offhand, "Probably this summer we'll gut the kitchen. That wall is ancient." I froze. Gut the kitchen? The kitchen where I spent thousands of mornings cooking for my husband and son, where a tiny burn mark still sits on the counter from when Cole baked at 10 years old. I looked at Alyssa, nodded, and said softly, "That's fine, as long as you like it." She didn't know that every time she said gut, I heard the crack of the past breaking. That night in my room, I opened the safe and checked the documents again. I added one more line to the plan. Day 18, sign the sale contract. Day 21, transfer complete. Day 24, leave. 3 weeks. Only 3 weeks left. I closed the safe, locked it, then sat on the bed, hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea. I looked around the small room. Each item I'd bought with my own hands, the purple floral curtains Edward chose, our wedding photo, the vase of dried flowers by the window. I knew that soon I would leave it all. Instead of sadness, I felt light. The next day, when Cole went to work, Alyssa sat in the living room with her laptop open, searching for kitchen inspo. She called me over in a syrupy voice. "Mom, do you think these tiles match?" I love that Scandinavian white and gray look, so classy. I looked at the screen, a gleaming, unfamiliar kitchen with no warmth at all. I nodded. It's pretty, Alyssa. It suits you too. Inside, a different smile bloomed, the smile of someone watching others paint on a board that's about to be wiped clean. That evening, Cole talked about a Hawaii vacation. He was excited, said he'd take 2 weeks off and bring Alyssa along, so you can rest at home. I answered, "Great idea, I'll watch the house." They both smiled and thanked me. They had no idea the day they boarded that plane would be the day I left their lives. I began moving in order, like a chess game. Every move calculated, no rushing, no missteps. I tidied my room, tossed unneeded papers, destroyed old bills that could reveal information. I took a few items to the charity shop, part habit, part making space in my luggage. On the 8th morning, I got a confirmation email. The house sale contract has been prepared. All procedures are legal. Waiting only for the signing date. I read it 3 times, then deleted the message, leaving no trace. That night, I sat in the dark living room with only one small lamp on. Alyssa and Cole were arguing about savings, but their voices faded. It all sounded like echoes from another world, the one I was about to leave. I sipped cold tea, watching the lamplight reflected on the wooden table, oddly indifferent. Every feeling, hurt, anger, bitterness, seemed to have frozen into a clear sheet of ice. On the outside, I looked like any other elderly mother. On the inside, I was counting moves in a silent game. I knew their habits precisely: when they left, when they returned, when the TV went on, when they slept. I learned to walk so lightly the floor wouldn't creak, to speak just enough so they'd think I was still obedient. A woman once locked in a bathroom for 2 days now held the controls again, and no one noticed. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the one finishing the game with precise moves. When Alyssa showed off the new kitchen render and Cole went on about Hawaii, I just nodded. Inside, I smiled a discreet, cool smile because I knew they were investing effort into a house that, in only 3 weeks, wouldn't be theirs. 3 weeks. 3 weeks for me to play the kind mother, the calm grandmother. 3 weeks to prepare for closing that door one last time, this time from the outside. One late February morning, fog veiled the road as I rode a taxi to the law office. Cold air slid through the window crack, carrying the usual metallic scent of traffic. I looked out the glass as bare trees slipped by, my heart strangely calm. After so many years, I was finally doing what I should have done long ago, deciding my own life. Attorney Harold greeted me with a small smile and a knowing nod. "That young couple is very discreet," he said. "Paying cash, no loan. I've checked their background, decent and trustworthy." I simply said, "I trust you." On the desk, the file was neatly stacked, not a single extra page. Everything had been reviewed: ownership verification, transfer contract, property handover documents. He handed me a pen with glossy black ink and said slowly, "All I need is your signature here, Lila. After today, this house will no longer be connected to you." I looked at the printed name, Lila Whitmore, bold and straight. My hand trembled slightly, not from doubt, but because years of bottled emotions were about to be released. I set the pen down and signed clean and decisive. As the pen lifted from the paper, I felt like I'd just closed a book I'd been reading too long, so long I'd forgotten I could put it down. "The transaction will be complete within 72 hours, Harold said, carefully gathering the documents. "The funds will go straight to your account. I'll hold the keys and hand them to the buyers the very morning you leave." I nodded. "Thank you, Harold. And please don't inform anyone." "Of course," he replied, quiet but firm. Disappearing deserves the same protection as privacy. When I stepped outside, the sun had broken through. Light touched my silver hair, and everything felt feather light. I paused on the sidewalk, watched people hurry by, then walked into the cafe across the street. A hot cappuccino arrived, foam thick and smooth. I took a sip, the sweet bitterness slid down my throat. For the first time in years, I felt a morning that truly belonged to me. By afternoon, I was home. Alyssa was on the phone. Cole was sprawled on the couch. I smiled and walked past like any other day. No one noticed a thing. In my room, I opened my laptop and searched for a faraway coastal town, Mariners Bay, Oregon. A small, quiet place with a green bay and rows of wooden houses. I read the description. A town of wind, where people come to start over. I chose an early morning flight one way, no return. I booked a small seaside room, a pale blue house with a white porch, less than 100 yards from the sand. The owner, a middle-aged woman, messaged back warmly, "Your room will be ready. Just bring the sunshine." I smiled. It had been a long time since anyone said something so kind to me. That night, while they watched TV, I slipped into my room and opened the wardrobe. The old suitcase brown leather, the one Edward bought when we were poor, lay at the bottom. I wiped off the dust, opened it, and folded each item slowly. A few simple outfits, a wool sweater, walking shoes, and the small wooden box holding Edward's wedding ring. I placed it on top, the final keepsake of a lifetime. I added an envelope of cash and a small document pouch with what I needed: passport, insurance paperwork, bank statements, everything fit snugly inside. I pulled the zipper, the small click sounding both familiar and new, like fate snapping shut. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. The room where I slept after my husband died, where I held my feverish boy through the night, where I believed love could conquer anything. Now it was just a temporary stop. I felt no regret, only lightness. I texted the woman at the corner grocery, Mrs. Peterson, who always set aside a small bottle of milk for me in the mornings. "Thank you for your kindness all these years. If I ever come back, I'll stop by." I didn't mention the date. I wanted this goodbye to have no farewell. That night, I lay listening to the wind slip through the window. Branches tapped the frame, the clock ticked, and from the next room the TV murmured on. I closed my eyes. No anger, no regret. Only a calm as still as water before dawn. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. I made coffee and carefully left 2 cups for them on the table, an old habit. I watched light filter through the curtains, dust floating in the air, and knew everything was closing. I called the taxi I'd booked and confirmed the flight. The ticket was already in my coat pocket. I wrote a short note, folded it, and placed it in the drawer beside the family photo. "Thank you for the years that were once warm. Don't look for me because I've found myself." I didn't sign my name. At noon, when Alyssa and Cole went out, I sat in the living room and looked around one last time. Sunlight fell on the walls where I once hung Cole's birthday photos, where Edward's laughter used to echo. I ran my hand across the wooden table, like saying goodbye to the past. I picked up the phone and called Harold. "I've signed. The handover date stays the same, right?" "That's right," he said. "I'll pass the keys to the buyers the very morning you leave." "Good," I said evenly. "Then it's done." I hung up and looked around again. Sparrows chirped on the porch. I smiled, a rare, genuine smile not meant for anyone to see. That night I put everything in order. I turned off all the lights, leaving only the hallway nightlight, the very light I'd once been scolded for as wasting electricity. It felt warm now, like a small sign seeing me off. When I lay down, my hand brushed the wedding ring in the suitcase. I closed my eyes and told myself, tomorrow morning I'm going. No looking back. I didn't dream. I only heard the far-off sound of wind, like the sea whispering the place waiting for me, where I would start again without having to prove anything to anyone. The most beautiful parting, I think, is leaving quietly, no explanations, no blame. Because those who hurt us will never understand the cruelest thing isn't revenge, it's disappearing when they still think you'll always be there. Dawn hadn't broken yet. The first light of day still slept behind the trees. I woke in silence, as if my body knew it was a special day. No alarm, no birds, only the sound of my own breathing, slow and steady. I sat up and gently pulled back the curtain. Outside, the street lay under a film of mist. The yellow streetlights hadn't turned off yet. Everything felt strangely peaceful, as if the world didn't know that in just a few hours an old mother would vanish from the house that once was her heart. I brewed tea, not coffee. I wanted to be clear but light. Steam rose, mint filling the quiet kitchen. I looked around the dining table, the stove, the chair where Edward used to fix his radio, so familiar, so dear, that I knew I had to leave now or I never would. When the clock struck 5 a.m., I opened the safe, took the envelope with the house keys, and sealed it carefully. I wrote one short line on the front, to Mr. Harold. Thank you for helping me close this chapter. I set the envelope on the table beside the small vase I'd arranged the night before, white orchids, my favorite. The hallway light shone across, brightening petals thin as mist. A simple scene, but enough to soften my farewell. I checked the suitcase, compact, worn, holding the rest of my life. Papers, a few clothes, the wedding ring, the photo of me with Edward and Cole when my boy was small. Everything set like a ritual. I drew the zipper. The click echoed in the quiet, like sealing fate. I put on a heavy coat and a knit scarf, then opened my door. The hallway was dark, only a sliver of light slipping from my son's room. Cole's soft snore, Alyssa's faint rustle. I paused, not from doubt, but from an old habit, making sure my loved ones were still sleeping. I didn't open their door. I just stood in the dark, listening to their breathing like a distant tide. Strangely, I felt no anger, only a quiet compassion for the version of me who believed for years that love could heal ingratitude. I looked around the hallway where the family photo still hung, the picture of me, Edward, and Cole at his graduation. In it, I'm smiling. Edward's hand rests on our son's shoulder, and Cole is looking straight at the camera, confident, bright, full of future. I touched the frame lightly, my fingertips trembling. Not from sadness, but from knowing that sometimes the beauty of a memory should only be kept in silence. I walked to the front door. The keys had already been left behind, so the lock was empty now. I tightened my grip on the suitcase handle, took a deep breath, then turned for one last look. The house was dark, except for the hallway light I'd intentionally left on. That light had once been switched off for saving electricity, but today I turned it on, not to light my way, but to remind the house that it once belonged to someone who was grateful for every brick. I smiled. Then I gently pulled the door closed. The sound was so soft it was like the last breath of a dream ending. I stood on the porch and drew in a long breath. The cold air rushed into my lungs and made me shiver, but in that chill there was a taste of freedom, the taste of early morning, of beginnings that don't need proof. At the end of the lane, the taxi was waiting. Its yellow lights glowed against the mist, a small halo in the dark. I rolled my suitcase. The wheels clicked lightly over the tiles, a steady tap-tap. Each step was a beat of farewell. I passed the flower bed where Edward once planted lavender he brought back from Tennessee. The bare, dry stems stood patiently through winter, as if they were seeing me off. At the gate, I turned my head once. Not to look, but to remember what it feels like to leave without regret. I didn't see the house, only a blur of mist around it. The hallway light spilled out faintly, like a flame about to go out. I knew once the sun rose, that light would be swallowed. But it didn't matter, what needed to be bright was already bright inside me. I walked to the car, opened the door, and sat down. The driver, a brown-skinned man with a deep voice, glanced back and asked, "Airport, right?" I nodded. "That's right." And please don't look back." He smiled lightly and asked nothing more. The car began to move. Through the window, the little street slid past, rooftops faded, then disappeared into the fog. I rested my hand on the suitcase and felt the warmth of the leather. In my mind, there was no house, no Alyssa, no Cole. Only one thought. Everything worth looking at is ahead. The highway opened up, streetlights dimming as dawn spread. I saw a blush of pink spilling across the horizon, the gentle light I'd waited for years. This time, I didn't have to wait for someone to wake me, didn't have to cook breakfast for anyone, didn't have to fear someone locking my door. I leaned back and let the wind slip in through the window crack. Dew on the glass caught the morning light, sparkling like tiny pieces of freedom. I closed my eyes and listened to the low hum of the engine like a steady heartbeat. A chapter had closed. I didn't know how long I would live in that coastal town, or whether Cole would ever look for me. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. Because for the first time in decades, I didn't belong to anyone, and no one had the right to claim me. As the car crossed the bridge, I saw the sun lift on the far side. Bright light spread across the sky, washing the water below in pink. I smiled. Leaving before dawn might be the gentlest way to end a life of entanglement. No one saw me go, no one sent me off, no one held me back, and I didn't need anyone. The trip began. No looking back. That morning, while I was on a flight headed for the Oregon coast, clouds floating below like cotton on the other side of the country, in the house I once called home, the doorbell rang 3 times. Cole stumbled out of the bedroom, hair messy, eyes still sleepy. Alyssa, wrapped in a robe with a coffee cup in hand, wore a scowl from being woken early. At the door stood a moving crew and a young couple, the man in glasses and a gray shirt, the woman in a beige dress holding a file folder. "Hello, we're the Reeds," the woman said with a gentle smile. "Per attorney Harold Benson's schedule, today is the handover." The living room air froze. Cole's eyes went wide, and Alyssa slammed her cup down so hard coffee splashed onto the wood floor. "Handover of what?" Cole rasped. "This property has completed the transfer," the man replied calmly. "We're the new owners. Here's a notarized copy of the contract." Alyssa snatched the papers and flipped through them quickly. At the bottom, my clean, familiar signature stood out. Lila Whitmore. Below it, the legal stamp with dates matching last week. No one spoke for a few seconds. Only the soft whir of the HVAC and the tick of the clock filled a room beginning to crack. Cole stammered, No way. This is my mother's house. We live here. There must be some mistake." The man with glasses answered evenly, "There's no mistake, sir. The paperwork is valid. The transaction is complete. Attorney Benson confirms all ownership has been transferred. Today is the handover, per the contract." Alyssa's face flushed crimson. She turned to her husband, voice pitching high. "Say something. How is this possible? The house is in your mom's name." Cole went silent. In his head, pieces of memory linked together the calm in my eyes, the long silences, the times I held documents without explaining, and especially that morning I woke early to make coffee and then disappeared. He rushed into the office, opened the laptop, and logged into the bank. The screen lit up. The balance in the account under Lila Whitmore was empty. The transaction history showed a large transfer out with a cold note attached. Final settlement closed. Alyssa ran through the house, yanking drawers, opening the safe. Empty. Nothing left, not even the documents they'd once hidden from me. Everything that mattered, the deed, insurance, certificates, was gone with me. Alyssa's scream echoed down the hall. "Where's the safe? Where is the safe?" Cole stood frozen, staring at the wall where the small safe used to sit, now just a square of lighter dust. His phone started ringing nonstop. An unknown number. He answered, voice shaking. "Hello, this is Cole Whitmore." A calm, professional voice replied, Hello, I'm the secretary for Attorney Harold Benson. We received your inquiry. I'm calling to confirm all transactions related to the property at 43 Maple Avenue are complete. By law, the home is now owned by Every 43. The Reed family. Mrs. Lila Whitmore was the lawful seller. Cole hung up. In that moment, his world fell apart in silence. The mother he thought only knew how to endure, to stay quiet, had left not with noise or blame, but with a legal signature colder than any anger. Alyssa sank into a chair, hands clutching her head. The kitchen deposit, $5,000, Cole. What are we going to do? Cole didn't answer. He walked to the window and looked out. The movers were carrying the young couple's furniture inside. Each piece crossing the threshold felt like a slap to his pride. He remembered Alyssa mocking me, the night she locked me in the bathroom, the times she said, "This is our house, not hers." Now the house wasn't theirs at all except for me, the one who chose to let it go at the right time. The new owner stepped into the living room and said politely, "We understand your surprise. But the contract is clear. Please arrange to move your belongings within 2 days. If you need more time, we can offer a temporary 2-week rental at a reduced rate." Alyssa turned pale. And Cole, for the first time, was truly silent. Not the detached silence he once used on me, but the silence of someone who realizes he's lost control. Back at the law office, Mr. Harold sent an email with the contract copy attached, and a brief note. Transaction is legal and irreversible. Any appeals must be filed through official channels. Mrs. Lila Whitmore has not provided contact information. There was no one left to call, no one to plead with. Cole's phone showed dozens of outgoing calls, all to one number. Mine. He called again and again. But on the other end, no one picked up. Only an automated voice, warm but distant. "The number you have dialed is not reachable at this time." Alyssa threw her phone on the table, voice breaking. "She's crazy. She can't do this." Cole answered softly, as if to himself. "She can, and she did." The empty house echoed with their footsteps, the clatter of disturbed things, doors slamming. All those sounds were nothing but background music for their late lesson. Somewhere else, I was sitting on the balcony of a small room overlooking the bay. Noon sunlight winked on the water, gulls circling in flocks. My phone buzzed. Cole's name lit the screen. 1, 2, 3, then 10 calls. I didn't touch it. I let it ring, then fall quiet. In that silence, I heard the waves clearly, gentle and steady. Some apologies only matter when the listener is still there. After they leave, everything is just wind. I sipped my tea and smiled. Not a triumphant smile, but the smile of someone who has taken back control of her life. In the old house, Cole and Alyssa finally dropped onto the floor, exhausted. Alyssa turned on the faucet to wash her hands. Cold water trickled weakly. She twisted the handle to hot, and a small click sounded in the pipes. Such a tiny sound, but it startled them both. Maybe in that instant, they remembered me, the woman once locked in a bathroom, shivering in a wet towel, listening to water drip by the second. And now, every time they turn on the hot water, that click will echo as a reminder that the former controllers have lost control for good. I lifted my head toward the sea, shimmering in the late light, the breeze combing through my silver hair. Everything was settled. No need for revenge, no noise. Sometimes justice is simply leaving at the right time, letting those who remain face the emptiness they created. The coastal town welcomed me with salt on the air and cool wind, a scent only those who have stood at the ocean's edge truly know. The taxi stopped at the top of a gentle slope. Below was a row of white-painted wooden houses, windows thrown open to the morning sun, and at the end of the road, the sea spread out like a giant mirror reflecting the sky. I rolled my suitcase down, its wheels clicked over gravel, a crisp, steady rhythm. like a new breath. The innkeeper, a middle-aged woman with brown hair, a sturdy build, and a kind smile greeted me warmly. "You must be Mrs. Whitmore. Your room's on the second floor, window straight to the bay. I've set out warm blankets and a kettle." The room wasn't large, but it was quiet enough to hear waves breaking on the shore. Cream-painted wood walls, light slipping through white curtains, touching the small table beside the bed. I opened the window and let the wind in, carrying gull cries and the raw tang of salt. On the little wooden table, I placed Edward's photo, the frame I'd brought from the old house. In it, he smiles gently, pale blue eyes shining with the rare patience of a man who's known a lifetime of work and loss. I touched the glass and whispered, "I'm here, Edward. At last I've learned to stand up on my own." The next morning, sunlight spilled across the wooden floor, sparkling like shards of golden glass. I brewed coffee, not the cheap instant I used to drink, but lightly roasted beans ground fresh. The aroma filled the room and mingled with the sea breeze, a new scent that felt strangely comforting. I went to the fish market at the dock, where sun-browned men hauled nets and rinsed fish under cold water. An old fisherman, hair white as sea foam, smiled at me. "New around here? Want to try halibut or fresh salmon?" I laughed and misnamed a few fish, making him chuckle. The next day, he saved me the best cut and said, "For Mrs. Whitmore, now you know what to pick." Day by day, I learned the names of the fish and the little paths to the beach. I learned to live slower, lighter, freer. In the afternoons, I often sat at the small cafe at the bottom of the hill, the one with the crooked wooden sign that read Sea Breeze Cafe. The owner, a gray-haired woman who tied a red scarf, always saved me the window table. I read the paper, nibbled apple pie, and watched the boats come in. No one knew who I was. No one asked where I came from. And I liked it that way. I hung a small orchid, the only thing I brought from my old house, by the window. When I left, it had only a few wilted leaves. Now, under the sea sun, a fresh green shoot has popped up. I take care of it every day, the way I'm learning to take care of myself again. At night, I shower with warm water as long as I want. No more knocking on the door, no more voices talking about the water bill, no more watchful eyes. I turn on the faucet and let the steam cover my body, feeling the frozen layers inside me being washed away. The water runs warm, steady, unbroken. And I realize the sound of water is no longer the sound of confinement, but the music of freedom. That night, I sat on the balcony with a cup of mint tea. The sea darkened under the moonlight. The waves were steady, soft, but deep. Each wave seemed to whisper something I had forgotten, that loss is not always an ending. Those 2 days locked in the bathroom once felt like a scar in my memory. I thought I'd carry it for life. But now, as I listen to the waves, that pain dissolves like salt in water. I no longer tremble at the thought of a turning lock. I feel calm, because if that door hadn't been locked that day, I might never have dared to step out of a life that bound me. This town is small, but enough for someone to be reborn. Every morning, I greet the newspaper seller, the mail carrier, and the kids biking past. They call me Miss Lila, as if I've lived here forever. No one is overly curious. No one brings up the past. I feel lighter by the day, as if each sea breeze carries away a little more of the old weight. I started keeping a journal. Every night before bed, I write down the small things. Today the sea was bluer than yesterday. Today I smiled a little more. Today I brewed better coffee than the first time. I write for myself, not to tell anyone. Sometimes I turn on a small radio and listen to old songs, the kind that make me remember, Edward. Remember when we were young, poor, and happy. I don't cry. I just smile, because in the sound of the waves, I feel like he's right beside me, watching me learn to love life again. One morning, walking along the beach, I saw a little boy building a sandcastle. A wave rolled in and washed it away. Instead of crying, he just looked at it and started again, more carefully. The sight made me stop in my tracks. I realized some things have to collapse before we know we can rebuild them, better and stronger. Whenever I look at the ocean, I see myself in it, gentle and strong, forgiving yet boundaried. I no longer resent Cole or Alyssa. I'm simply grateful to them because they pushed me to my limit, and in doing so, I discovered I could start over at an age when people assume you only wait for rest. At night, I hear the wind press over the wooden roof, and it feels like the whole world is breathing with me. I whisper to myself, half prayer, half affirmation. Leaving isn't running away. Leaving is choosing yourself. And that's exactly it. I've chosen the rest of my life with my own 2 hands. I don't need anyone's forgiveness, anyone's recognition. I only need enough courage to keep walking, enough peace to sleep well, and enough freedom to turn on warm water every morning without fearing a knock at the door. The sea out there is still open, like a door that never locks, and I, the woman once shut in a cold bathroom, have finally found the real key to my life. One early morning, when the sun was still peeking behind the sand dunes, I woke earlier than usual. The wind carried a soft salt scent and the chatter of gulls on the wooden roof. I slipped on a light sweater, poured myself a hot coffee, and stepped onto the porch. In front of me, the ocean stretched in a pale pink of dawn, waves beating gently, like the heartbeat of someone learning to love life again. I sat in the familiar wooden chair and breathed deep. The cold slid into my lungs, then melted into warmth. I remembered it all. The mornings in the old house, Alyssa's sharp footsteps, Cole's cool eyes, the click of the bathroom lock, a sound that haunted me through so many nights. But today, I didn't feel pain. I felt light and grateful. Because without those 2 locked days, I wouldn't have had these 2 peaceful years. Without the betrayal, I wouldn't have known freedom. On the windowsill, my orchid is blooming. The white petals, thin as paper, tremble in the early breeze. I set my hand on the frame and whispered, "Edward, do you see? I'm all right. I found myself again." I remembered when we were young, working all week for a simple dinner, but always with laughter. Edward used to say, "If one day I'm not here, live so you're not afraid of anything." I didn't fully understand that until now. I used to fear loneliness, loss, being left behind. But it turns out the scariest thing isn't losing others, it's losing yourself in submission. Now my days are simple and complete. Morning walks on the sand, a small lunch at noon, watering the orchid in the afternoon, reading by the window at night. I've started teaching the neighbor kids how to sew and how to plant. Some days they call me Grandma Lila, and it makes me laugh. I've never had a title that felt so easy. People here are used to the sight of an older woman with silver hair, a gentle smile, and a basket of fresh fish in her hand. No one knows my backstory, and I don't need them to. I've left the past behind not by forgetting, but by setting it down where it belongs. One afternoon I received a postcard without a return address. The handwriting was familiar, a little shaky. It was Cole's. "Mom, I'm sorry. Everything's changed. I understand now." I looked at it for a long time, then tucked it into my journal between 2 blank pages. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Forgiveness isn't opening the door for someone to come back, it's closing the door that once wounded you. That night, I took another long shower. Warm water ran over my shoulders down to the floor, fogging the mirror. I looked at my reflection, older, more lines, but calmer and more at ease than ever. I murmured, "This old lady finally did it." Outside, the waves kept breaking. I opened the door and let the breeze carry the sound inside. Moonlight fell across my shoulders, soft as an old blanket. In that moment, I knew I was truly free. No big house needed, no recognition, no thunderous revenge, just peace. Just the knowledge that the woman once locked in a bathroom has now unlocked her own life. I wrote the final line in my journal before closing it. Life can take many things from us, but if we still dare to choose ourselves, then we haven't lost anything. Then I set down the pen and blew out the candle, letting the night close softly like a finished chapter. Dawn rose again offshore. I stepped onto the porch, closed my eyes, and let the sea breeze brush my cheeks. Each wrinkle felt like it smiled with the morning light. I knew that from here on, every day is a gift of courage, of freedom, and of myself. And if someone is listening to this story, maybe a mother, a grandmother, or someone who's been hurt, I only want to say this: don't be afraid to leave if staying means losing yourself. Don't be afraid to start over, even late. Dawn always waits, as long as you're brave enough to open the door and step out. I'm grateful you've walked with me to the very end of this journey, every second, every feeling, every breath of this story. If you're listening from a faraway city, maybe New York, Seattle, Houston, or Miami, please leave a hello in the comments. I want to know where you're listening from and what made you stay to the very end. If my story touched you, please like, subscribe, and don't forget to turn on notifications for new journeys from women like me, women who once fell but never gave in. Because with your listening, my story truly lives.